If you clicked on this video, you're probably very cynical about electoralism, the current election season, voting as we know it in the US. And I wanted to compile all of these different videos that I've worked on over the past few months because they do explore a lot of the different topics about why you or I or other people are very cynical about what US electoralism has to offer. So, hi, my name is Prince. I post videos and things online about Black history, about queer and radical history, about anti capitalism, about James Baldwin, and so many other things. And this is a video that's a compilation of a bunch of different things I've worked on over the past few months. I have enjoyed synthesizing so many of these ideas, whether it be my cynicism around Democratic politicians like Kamala Harris, whether it be about the Trump assassination and rising fascism, whether it be about how we memify politics. There are so many different ways that we can dig into our cynicism as a means to be productive and turns towards liberatory practices. And that's really what I want this channel to be about. That's what I want this compilation to be about. So if you're old or new to the channel, hopefully if you're new, it'll give you a bunch of ideas and things to talk about. And it can be something that you can share with your friends to engage in dialogues and conversation. And if you have already been here, watch it to refresh because pretty soon I'm going to be dropping a really extensive video that's called My Anti-Voting Guide, where I explore the pitfalls of US electoralism, where I talk about Black struggles towards autonomy and how we should be leaning more towards a decolonial look at how we engage with electoralism and decolonization and militancy and so many other things. So buckle up, get your popcorn, get your water, get angry, and thank you for watching another video on my channel. So to enter this conversation, I want to start us off with looking at this kind of core myth given to Black people via enslavement, via capitalism, which is this myth that Black capitalism will essentially lead us to liberation. And a text that I want to bring into this conversation is by W.E.B. Du Bois. It's called Black Reconstruction in America by W.E.B. Du Bois. And for those that don't know, W.E.B. Du Bois was a prominent African-American sociologist, historian, civil rights activist, author, and educator, born February 23, 1868 in Barrington, Massachusetts. Du Bois was a leading intellectual and advocate for African American rights in the late 19th and 20th century. He is known for The Soul of Black Folks and the text we're going to read today, which is Black Reconstruction in America, which was published in 1935. And what this text looks at is a lot of the myths that are around, or it analyzes the labor reasonings for why emancipation happened, why Black Reconstruction happened, and what were the different logics across the racial lines in the North and the South. And what I like about this text is that it really analyzes and holds to task some of the assumptions that I think we have on a contemporary level around why different groups of white people wanted slavery or wanted an end to slavery. There's the classical kind of understanding that the South wanted slavery because it was a cheap labor force and it helped bolster their economy. And there was very much this northern-southern division in terms of how the US wanted to approach economics. But on the other hand, this looks at how certain whites wanted an end to slavery on another level because they had their own desire to drive towards another kind of capitalism. In one section of Black Reconstruction in America, it reads, "The espousal of the doctrine of Negro inferiority by the South was primarily because of economic motives and the interconnected political urge necessary to support the slave industry. But to the watching world, it sounded like the carefully crafted thought out result of experience and reason. Because of this, it was singularly disastrous for modern civilization in science and religion, in art and government, as well as in industry. The South could say that the Negro, even when brought into modern civilization, could not be civilized, and that therefore he and the other colored people of the world were so inferior to whites that the white world had a right to rule mankind for their own selfish interests. But in modern times, has a large section of a nation so used its combined energies to the degradation of mankind. The hurt to the Negro in this era was not only his mistreatment and slavery, it was the wound dealt to his reputation as a human being. Nothing was left, nothing was sacred, and while the best and more cultivated and more humane of the planters did not themselves always repeat to calumny. These workers came to oppose slavery not so much from the moral as from the economic fear of being reduced by competition to the level of slaves. They wanted a chance to become capitalists, and they found that chance threatened by the competition of a working class who says the bottom of the economic structure seemed permanent and inescapable. At first, black slavery jarred upon them, and as easily as the 17th century German immigrants to Pennsylvania asked the Quakers innocently if slavery was in accord with the Golden Rule. Then gradually, as succeeding immigrants were thrown in difficult and exasperating competition with black workers, their attitude changed. These were the very years when the white worker was beginning to understand the early American doctrine of wealth and property. The new immigrants in their competition with this group reflected not simply the general attitude of America towards colored people, but particularly they felt a threat of slave competition, which these Negroes foreshadowed. The Negroes worked cheaply, partly from custom, partly as their own defense against competition. The white laborers realized that Negroes were part of a group of millions of workers who were slaves by law and whose competition kept white labor out of the work of the South and threatened its wages and stability in the North. When now the labor question moved west and became a part of the land question, the competition of black men became of increased importance. Foreign laborers saw more clearly than most Americans the tremendous significance of free land in abundance, such as America possessed, in contrast to the land monopoly of Europe. But here on this free land, they met only a few free Negroes. Essentially explores this notion that no matter where we turn across racial lines, capitalism always demands that someone is at the bottom. Capitalism always demands from whiteness that they either necessitate a cheap or free labor force, an enslaved labor force, or they fear that the system they have set up will work so much that they will be left out of the economy altogether. And so what does it say that black people, that enslaved blacks have been brought here, have been enfolded into slavery, have escaped slavery, worked towards America's economy during segregation, fought out of segregation, and now fuel the economy in an entirely different way through the prison industrial complex and the advent of over-policing, killing black people off day by day. And in this text, W.E.B. Du Bois breaks down a number of ways that being enfolded into Americanism and also participating in the U.S. economic system through the Reconstruction era had a lot of pitfalls, and some of these are economic exploitation and sharecropping. One of the critical points Du Bois makes is about the economic exploitation of black labor. After the Civil War, many blacks were forced into sharecropping, a system that kept them in a cycle of debt and poverty. The economic arrangement benefited white landowners while trapping black families in pseudo-slavery conditions. Political disenfranchisement. Du Bois documents the various methods used to disenfranchise black voters, including violence, intimidation, legal barriers like literacy tests, and poll taxes, and the role of white labor. Du Bois critically examines the role of white labor in maintaining racial divisions. He argues that white workers, although also exploited by capitalist interests, often aligned with the ruling class to uphold white supremacy. This alignment prevented a unified working class struggle against economic exploitation, illustrating how racial divisions were used to perpetuate broader systemic inequalities. And so what is really important is that this text is opening us up to not only the question of whether or not black people should have participated in the American project. I think what Du Bois is secretly exposing here is that even within white culture and white supremacy, there is the very serious question of how capitalism and economics has corrupted their racial and moral psyche. And so when we look at this, we can only assume that if white supremacy was created by white culture and this demand for colonization and manifest destiny, what does it mean when black people have been enfolded into this and we continue to follow the same logic of I need to get my car, I need to get my Lamborghini, I need to get mine, I need to be the individual like I've explored in other videos, and where can this lead us? And I think it has led us to exactly where we are today. And the reason I wanted to mention this is that I think built into Americanism is this kind of deep understanding that there is kind of a nobility to the American dream. Like, there have been mistakes along the way. Like, white people didn't really mean to have slaves, or the immigrants that came here and ended up being anti-black or just wanting to be capitalists themselves. Like, they were buying into a sort of dream or a vision. And in this dream and vision, I see a fatal flaw. It's this idea that if we go to another land, if we assimilate and we participate in the systems and the processes that they have, most likely we will be saved. And for me, this is a really deep and complicated predicament to unpack as a child of an immigrant, as I've mentioned in other videos and in my book, When They Tell You to Be Good. And for those that don't know, hi, my name is Prince. I do videos on Black culture, Black history, anti-capitalism, and the writing life. So if you want more videos like this, please like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know what else you want to see in the future. Editing me put this clip of me introducing myself at the beginning because we should try to do that more in these videos to give people context. But yeah, and I wrote about this in the book actually, but I have been a long time organizer. In 2016, I was doing a lot of organizing around Standing Rock, and I was actually there when the 2016 election happened. And I remember there were only a few spots in the camps there that you could really get good signal. And I remember waking up the day after the election and checking my phone and being flabbergasted when I saw the news. And I remember calling my mother. And for context, my mother immigrated to the US, was a citizen was a permanent resident for a number of years. And then around the time that Obama was running, she became a full-fledged citizen. And what she's always told me is like, I kind of became a citizen so I could vote for the first Black president, which I've always thought was beautiful until Obama started being on some bullshit. But basically, my mom called me and she basically was shocked. And she said, why did I become a citizen for this? And that question has stuck with me so much then, because I think of all the sacrifice that her and other women and men in my family have gone through to immigrate here, to build their lives here, to have children here, to cultivate a legacy, to invest in so many of the ideals that America has, or to feel compelled to assimilate for their own safety and the safety of their children. And what does it mean that through all of this effort, through all of this effort towards legibility, that still the result can be a rapist, genocidal, criminal. But that's like every president, right? And so in this context, I think there is the deeper question of what are we really reaching for when we're reaching for the American dream? And what happens when that dream actually turns into a nightmare that you or the ones you love actually have to escape? And in that moment, I didn't really have anything to say to my mother because I was just kind of thinking like, I'm literally at a indigenous movement that is against colonization, and I am not invested in the mainstream. And so it was this very real moment where I definitely knew it was important to listen to my mother and hear her out. I knew that what she was asking was important, and I knew that it felt like some kind of shift or a breaking point or a change in paradigm. And it really brings up the question of what is the utility of becoming a citizen in a state, in a country that really has no promise of protecting you? Because you can either look at the law or you can look at what is done extrajudicially, but Black life in the US is always on the line. Don't vote within a system that is fascist in order to buy yourself more time to fight fascism. Fascism is a political process that uses propaganda, that uses political force, that uses state violence, and it uses policy to remove entire populations of people from sovereignty, from citizenship, from having human rights, from having civil rights. And if we look at both parties, they operate to that function on many, many different levels. If you support policing and you support someone going into office who was a DA, who was a prosecutor, why would you not understand that people are going to question that this was someone who literally worked as an arm of the state under the guise of putting abusers and et cetera away, when Kamala Harris and her office was passing anti-truancy policies that locked up parents for their kids not going to school. So if we want to talk about the carcerality of Blackness, if we want to talk about the fungibility of Blackness, of foundational place that Black people are put in, and how politicians like Obama, like Kamala Harris, still reinforce this kind of anti-Black structural kind of narrative because they operate to go against political dissent, especially political dissent by Black people, by Black movements. And so first, I just think it's really, really not for me to think that getting rid of Biden means we're safer, because you're either going to have repression by your president going on TV and saying that these protests are bad, they're dumb, and then local police is going to feel justified in going in and brutalizing protesters and arresting them. Or you might have a Republican where they'll literally go in and they might shoot someone, or they might literally unalive them. What we have to look at is the different forms of repression that both of these parties are utilizing. I guess I wanted Biden not to run, but I didn't really think that the Democratic Party could really push any candidate that would represent enough of my politics for me to actually vote for them. And then two, I don't believe Kamala Harris is a saint. I don't buy into this American kind of ethos that is being given that politicians are human beings just like us too, and they make mistakes and they can learn, and oh my gosh, like you should read her record, she made progress. The point is that Kamala Harris spun this narrative about wanting to fight abusers, about wanting to put abusers away, when if we literally look at and study the carceral system, we can see that countless cops are domestic abusers, resort to sexual crimes when they're in their job. Jails and prison systems also operate as institutions of sexual violence, no matter who you are inside. And so there is this kind of core logic that we're being asked to buy into, which is like, oh, she's a feminist. She became a prosecutor or a DA or an attorney general to be a feminist. But what we also have to analyze is how modern capitalism yields identity and puts it at the top and uses that representation as some sign of progress. When if a white person was passing the same policies that Kamala Harris was passing and saying a lot of the same things that Kamala Harris is saying, we would say that this is a lukewarm person that doesn't actually care about making sure that Black and brown people don't really end up in jail and prisons. We would say that this is a white person who was willing to align with Zionism and conflate protests against genocide with being unpatriotic, which actually, if you actually think about it, I mean, genocide is pretty patriotic. So Kamala Harris isn't lying, but we have to be able to name the lie and understand that she operates to serve the status quo. If over 200 people have been arrested protesting Congress and expressing their freedom of speech and exercising their right to protest, yet it's considered unpatriotic because somehow Zionism does align with what America wants, what the American project is. And so I think even in the language that we're seeing, we have to be able to analyze what is happening. And I'm going to read some of the statement that Kamala Harris's office came out with after Netanyahu visited Congress. And there's also the fact that she literally met with Netanyahu, and I wonder how that went. I wonder how hard she's going for Palestinians. Yesterday at Union Station in Washington, D.C., we saw despicable acts by unpatriotic protesters and dangerous hate-filled rhetoric. I condemn any individuals associating with the brutal terroristic organization Hamas, which has vowed to annihilate the state of Israel and kill Jews. Pro-Hamas graffiti and rhetoric is abhorrent, and we must not tolerate it in our nation. I condemn the burning of an American flag. The flag is a symbol of our highest ideals as a nation and represents the promise of America. It should never be decimated in that way. I support the right to protest peacefully, but let's be clear, anti-Semitism, hate, and violence of any kind have no place in this country. So
here they are pepper spraying people who are exercising their constitutional rights. It's disgusting. It's absolutely criminal. Okay, this is supposed to be the house of the people. That this is supposed to be where people in the United States are allowed to express their views, a place for the government to represent the will of the people, and here they are pepper spraying us.
We can see that a Democrat is portraying pro-Palestinian protests as inherently being conflated with Hamas, just like Netanyahu does, just like the right wing does, just like the Republican Party does. And so there is this really serious question right now in this era of trying to bratify Kamala Harris or make her a girl boss or make funny t-shirts about how she said, oh, we fell out of a coconut tree. Instead of mythologizing Kamala Harris into being this funny, like kind of non-threatening woman, we should actually look at her as someone that corroborates the narrative of Netanyahu and the Project of Zionism by portraying rightful protests against the war crimes, against the atrocities that Israel and the Israeli military is committing against Palestinians. And not only Palestinians, but their own people, their own Jewish people that are resisting what the state of Israel is doing. And Kamala Harris aligns with this. Why should this make us feel safe? And what does this mean about our actual commitment to Palestinian liberation? There are so many more conversations and discussions to be had, but I do think it's important to question why Kamala Harris's nomination puts so many people in a kind of comfortable place. When I think about resistance, I'm reminded that it starts with our capacity to define justice for ourselves, to break the right rules, to start good trouble, as John Lewis would say. Are you prepared to fight?
President Obama, those cages that were shown, I think they were very inappropriate. They were built by President Obama's administration.
I want to talk about how Democrats have consistently thrown social and political movements under the bus. More specifically, Black Democrats, more specifically, Obama. And if we're looking at the only example that we really have of a Black person becoming president and what they did and how they operated and whether or not they actually arose to the occasion of what their Black voters wanted, we could look at Obama. We could look at Obama. And I'm going to analyze Obama through the issues that I personally care about, which are race, immigration, and how we think about or commit war, how we commit war. Obama's history in terms of his immigration policies, because if we look at Obama, we can easily say like, oh, he was a black man. But what did he actually represent on a legislative level? And what did he actually want or push for? First, I have this article that's titled Immigration Policies Under Barack Obama. And one of the first paragraph reads, during the first years of Obama's presidency, the number of immigrants deported from the U.S. increased each year, peaking at 409,849 total deportations in the fiscal year 2012. At the time, pro-immigrant groups nicknamed Obama the deporter-in-chief in protest of policies. After 2012, the annual deportation number decreased, totaling just 235,413 deportations in the fiscal year 2015. And then there is another piece titled Obama's Mixed Legacy on Immigration. And this reads, very importantly, there is no two ways about it. President Obama created the harshest and largest immigration enforcement regime in American history at the time. And it goes on to say, the Obama administration has not been more lenient on employers than previous administrations, either issuing 15.5 times as many fines against employers and 8.3 times as many arrests for immigration law violations as did George W. Bush by the end of 2014. President Obama's Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency has also been encouraging businesses to sign up to E-Verify, an expensive government program that is supposed to weed unlawful immigrants out of the workforce. Moreover, the Obama administration has expanded detention and jail-like conditions for many of the roughly 231 children asylum seekers since 2020. As the final immigration act of his presidency, Obama ended the decades-old wet feet, dry feet policy that allowed Cubans fleeing the most tyrannical government in the Western Hemisphere to enter the U.S. easily. Many Cubans were already en route to the U.S., with one exclaiming, "I got here hours late," as he was denied. And if we're looking at what a Democrat is actually capable of, if you read all of those policies and think about them, the fact that a Black person can operate as a smokescreen just shows you how identity politics is continuously being yielded and co-opted by the elite in order to get us to vote for someone that we think aligns with our policies and ideas. And this is also a deeper question. There are going to be people out there that support Obama because generally he's good on race, and maybe they're not actually about immigrants coming here and taking away our jobs, which is actually also a part of the problem. It's an alt-right talking point saying that we only need immigrants here to contribute to the economy because human beings are only valuable when they contribute to the economy. Does that not sound like a white supremacist narrative to you? Be careful, y'all. Be careful. Be careful. And these immigration policies to me are just personally personally fucking disgusting because they resort to punitive measures where people that are coming here to seek political asylum are literally criminalized and pushed out of processes that should be here if we claim to be a melting pot, if we claim to be a unified nation, if we claim to care about the poor, meek, and hungry. We don't. We just care about the poor, meek, and hungry that can come here and actually like get jobs. Or we care about the poor, meek, and hungry that we can't criminalize and use as a way to bolster our borders or our policing system. I come from a family of immigrants. I come from a family of people where a lot of the men in my family were here undocumented. There have been people in my family who have been undocumented for years. And the criminalization of undocumented people, I think, is such a white hegemonic kind of ethno-state kind of logic. And it falls so much in line with white supremacy because it's saying there's only one kind of immigrant that we want here. There's only one kind of person coming in that we want. There's only one kind of refugee. And those other people, we can criminalize and put them in jails, and those jails can earn money. Or we can find another scapegoat so there can be someone else at the bottom. So when we pass more punitive policies, it becomes justified. These punitive measures reinforce that narrative because they say that our only solution, our only viable solution worth peddling money to, worth funneling super PAC money to, is to criminalize the immigrant, is to resort to xenophobia. And I think xenophobia is very much a spectrum. There's the area of xenophobia where you're literally saying that we only want a white country. And then there's also the area of xenophobia that is willing to lock up children at the border and put them through trial where they barely even have a translator, lock them up in cages, separate them from their parents. Where do you think Trump learned it from? It was because Obama was in office and doing the same thing. And then, of course, my favorite topic, let's talk about how our black president in the past reacted to Black Lives Matter and political violence in reaction to police brutality. After the Baltimore riots in reaction to Freddie Gray, as I mentioned in my last video, Obama very quickly threw rioters and protesters under the bus.
That won't be done by throwing bottles. That won't be done by smashing car windows. That won't be done by using this as an excuse to vandalize property.
And we can see this happen time and time again during the uprising of Black Lives Matter, during the Ferguson Rebellion in 2014. We can see it again in the protests that happened during 2016 and how he reacted to what was happening in Standing Rock. And we can also see how Obama reacted in 2020 when he talked about what people were doing in response to the police murder of George Floyd, which enacted a movement that spread around the globe. And if you look at Obama's language again and again, it's always trying to tone police, the anger that people are feeling around police brutality and structural racism. It's always looking to spin a reading of Black history where we only resorted to nonviolent direct action. I mean, literally, what were slave rebellions? What was Harriet Tubman doing? In April 2015, Obama said, "No excuse for violence in Baltimore." You mean a man being put into the back of a car and his back being broken in numerous places and people being angry about that? There's no excuse for riots in response to that? I wonder how much you're getting paid to say this, Obama? June 2020. And what did Obama say then? Former US President Barack Obama on Monday condemned the use of violence at nationwide protests over racial equalities and excessive police force, while praising the actions of peaceful protesters seeking change. The vast majority of protesters have been peaceful, but a small majority were putting people at risk and harming the very communities the protests are intended to help, Obama wrote in an online essay posted on Medium. It's fucking bullshit. It's fucking bullshit. Any politician that calls for peaceful protests, even if you have a peaceful protest, police can go in and they're usually the ones escalating the fucking violence. Here in Ohio, when the 2020 protests happened, police would regularly go in, tear gas the crowds, terrorize people, shoot rubber bullets at them. If you're doing that around sundown, it's going to wake up some historical rage. And that's exactly what we saw happen in Ferguson in 2014. Police went in and instigated violence against protesters and then used those images and those videos to call call in National Guard and to bring in more police brutality and terror. And the same thing happened in 2020. There were peaceful protests, and even if there were a few nights of violent reaction or violent rioting, there's also the question of, is this response not justified? Is the violence of the state more legitimate than the violence of regular citizens resisting a police force, a carceral state that can literally go into your home and shoot you for holding a pan of water, and then turn off their body cam and then corroborate their evidence together as police officers? Because police officers are human beings. They have a race, they have a ethnic background, and they deserve to be protected too. Do you remember in 2020 when there were laws being pushed to saying that you fucking hated cops was the same thing as a hate crime? Criminalization, this villainization of the violent protester, of the rioter, I think is a criminalization of the justifiable anger that Black people are feeling for being subjected to racial tyranny year after year, after decade, after century, without any real or legitimate reckoning with the structural reasoning that police exist, which is to reinforce a slave labor system. Watch the 13th Amendment, read the 13th Amendment. And so when politicians use these language to criminalize violent protesters, what they're essentially saying is that these people deserve to go to jail. And we need to criminalize dissent. But if we look at American history, all dissent has ever really done has led to more establishment of human rights. And so what does it say that politicians are against dissent? Whether it be peaceful or whether it be a violent protest that was instigated by police, because they do go in to instigate. Like, have you seen the Sonia Macy video? And when we're analyzing these Black politicians, I think we have to analyze them in terms of how they function for the status quo. If a Black politician is dissuading racial unrest, if they are passing laws that either simply reform certain aspects of the policing and prison system, passing laws that further criminalize immigrants, refugees, undocumented people, we have to ask, are these Black politicians not literally serving the function of police, which are there to enforce laws or not in order to establish the status quo? A Black cop is a Black cop. A Black prosecutor is a Black prosecutor. A Black pig is still a Black pig. In the context we need to add is a bit more specifics about Kamala Harris's history of talking about crime, how she positions herself as a prosecutor, as a DA, as an attorney general. And one really great piece of evidence for this is the fact that a few years ago, Kamala Harris wrote a book called Smart on Crime. And there's actually a shorter essay out there where she explains her perspective on crime in order to situate us and why we have to be really critical of people that go into the establishment, go into the state and try to make changes that look progressive or model some kind of prison reform kind of outlook, which is the fact that prison reform doesn't look at the structural function of how police even started in the first place. Police started as a way to control enslaved Blacks who were trying to flee to freedom. Black codes were instituted, that became slave patrols, and that became the basis for modern policing as we know it. And so if we look at America today, crime largely operates as a socio-political response to the needs that people have. Poverty is criminalized, gender expression is criminalized, being undocumented is criminalized. Being a kid skipping school, you can be criminalized. Your parents can be criminalized. You can even go into debt if you don't have enough money to pay for school. When we look at how Western society approaches crime in the first place, the state defines what a crime is based on what they see as something that is a social contagion, something that shouldn't be in public. And there is a dangerous kind of area that we can enter when we trust police to be smart on crime, but it actually just reinforces this kind of nonprofit industrial complex model where we build new arms and institutions and processes within a larger structural system of violence. And these processes give us the semblance of progress. They give us the semblance of a carceral system that is humane. When from the start, our carceral system is meant to be a form of slave labor. And so if we dress these things up and make it look smarter, we're only reforming ourselves deeper into a different kind of configuration of what carceral violence can look like. And I want to bring forward a piece by Current Affairs that came out in 2020. And this article is called "Why Crime Isn't the Question and Police Aren't the Answer." And then this article, it talks about how this person who was very pro-police wrote a critique of a book that essentially talked about a lot of structural critiques of policing. And this reads, "First, Iglesias' piece is all about crime, but he never explores what the word means. The concept of crime is constructed by those who have power. Throughout history, powerful people have determined crime in ways that benefit wealthy and white people. For example, cocaine, marijuana, and opium were made illegal to target specific racial minorities. And even within categories of acts that are classified as crimes, powerful people decide where to look for these acts, when to look for them, and which ones to ignore and which ones to document. Students at universities, for example, frequently violate underage drinking, drug, sexual assault laws without carceral punishment, while Black people who often live down the street are surveilled, searched, arrested, beaten, jailed, or rendered homeless, jobless, and traumatized for similar behavior. A schoolyard fight at a wealthy private school may mean a call to parents, but the same fight at a school filled with poor children is recorded as a crime and prosecuted. The entire system is filled with these examples. Second, the data and reporting about crime that Iglesias cites comes from police themselves. Police are not some objective body neutrally enforcing the law. Not only do they choose to look for some crimes committed by some people in some neighborhoods some of the time, but they have political incentives to manipulate the data they collect and not to collect other data at all. Third, perhaps most importantly, what constitutes a crime in the US is divorced from what causes harm. The standard narrative of police as central to public safety rings hollow when one considers actual cases of injury and death. For example, tobacco kills 480,000 people every year in the US, including 41,000 from secondhand smoke. This dwarfs police reported data on deaths from drugs that police call crimes. The same is true of water pollution, air pollution, and fraudulent home foreclosures. Our ultimate goal should be preventing unnecessary harm, preventing unnecessary violence, as opposed to targeting crime. When we are targeting crime, we're following the state's logic that gets to determine what laws are, that gets to determine what crimes are, and they get to reconfigure the language that they use in order to funnel money to different parts of carcerality or policing. If reforms are passed where there's more body cameras or dash cameras on police cars in order to allow there to be documentation of police violence, does this not only mean that we're funneling more money towards police when that same money used for dash cams or body cameras could be used for community food, for mutual aid, for public housing? And this smart on crime logic is simply just saying, how can we be smarter about the way that we market the violence and harm of carcerality? And if Kamala Harris is invested in reforming policing as we know it, is invested in simply changing the language, but not the actual function of police, because in her mind, police operate to keep communities safe, to keep families safe, to monitor what the communal good is. And for most Americans, for most people that understand the seriousness of carceral violence, we understand that police can change their minds whenever the fuck they want, no matter what policy is in office, no matter what legislation is in office, because we have never lived in a society, and we have never lived in an era of the US where police were actually held accountable on a deep structural mass level.
Raise your hand. It's saying people shouldn't have to go to jail. And you could see these hands just start to run up. I said, hold on. One human being kills another human being. A woman is raped. A child is molested. Is that what we're saying? So the knee-jerk response was to suggest we don't want law enforcement and public safety. But that's not what we mean. So that has to be part of what we talk about.
It's the reason I needed to talk about her. It's the reason I needed to talk about her. And so to not give you the whole thing, she basically 11 years ago did this conversation, and a part of the talk to this audience was basically saying how a part of her approach as a prosecutor is that there are distinctions in crime that our carceral system should be accounting for in terms of how people are punished, and that she views it on the most basic level as a dichotomy between violent crime and nonviolent crime. And there's certain crimes at the top of her pyramid that are like extremely violent and blah, blah, blah. but then she goes on to say, like, but also crime needs to be swiftly dealt with. And the reason I fucking hate this talk, is what is disingenuous is that she's trying to align herself with progressives by saying, oh yeah, I agree that our prison system should be reformed. I agree that it should be reformed. Like those people that say that they don't want people in jail. She presents a situation where she asks an audience, oh, do you believe people shouldn't be in jail? People raise their hands. Then she says, oh, what about these really violent crimes? And she basically uses that example of people being like, oh, a violent crime. She says, oh, well, people do need law enforcement to deal with violent crime. A part of the point of prison abolition, and this is just why I have to say it, a part of the point of prison abolition is that we understand that, yes, human beings are capable of violence. Violence is a part of biological life, but to respond to that violence that is a socio-political and biological part of the way that humans interact with an institution of violence that is financially incentivized, that is racially incentivized, that literally utilizes forms of self-defense like Krav Maga, that administer more pain than necessary, that uses weaponry to attack and torture its own citizens. And that whole structure is based in racism. And this is what is dangerous about having Black people run for office and being smart enough to know how to parrot certain kinds of language, because this is what is weird. This is what is weird. Now make a weird correlation. I think in a similar way to how people admire Trump for his crassness and how gangster he is or how upfront he is, I think people also admire Kamala Harris because of how articulate she is, how charismatic she is. And this is the part of electoralism in politics that I really don't fucking trust, which says if they have a personality, if they're interesting, if they're aesthetically pleasing, that can be enough, because even if they don't represent the things that we actually want to represent as a human species or as a society, which is maybe we should be against genocide wholeheartedly. If a politician doesn't represent that, at least you can use these signifiers. You can say, oh, that's a Black woman. That's a Black Asian woman. Like, oh my God, like she's worked hard. Like she's the best we have. She gives us more time. More time for what? To buy into an illusory argument about incarceration. And I think this is the death trap. This is the death trap. Maybe it's not white supremacy that upends America. Maybe it's actually maybe it's this falsehood that other identities will save us as long as they're also conditioned to be okay with Americanism. And oh my God, seeing that talk, oh my God.
Less jails. Build more schools, less jails. There's a fundamental problem with that approach, in my opinion. And it's this. I agree with that conceptually, but you have not addressed the reason I have 3 padlocks on my front door.
If Kamala Harris becomes president, mark my words, social movements, public dissent. I think any kind of progressivism that leans towards militancy or dramatic public disruption, she's going to be like, oh, no. And this is what I think we have to be careful about, because liberals also propagandize. If you respond to righteous dissent with fear-mongering, you're propagandizing. A Black war criminal is still a Black war criminal. Why does the possibility of a Trump presidency make Kamala Harris a more desirable candidate? It's because the American public is so afraid of Trump and his vitriol and his base that they are not actually ready to think about what real anti-fascism work will look like, what opposing real and increased state-sanctioned violence will look like. The reason that a Trump presidency scares people is, one, because there's the very real threat of people's rights being taken away. But I think beyond that, there's the very real threat that none of us are ready to actually fight to defend ourselves against fascism, against our government, against the many shaded ways that it will pass reform or put a Democrat in front of us and just dress that fascism up differently. But what I think the ease that people are feeling about a Kamala Harris says is that I think they really think that she will make things easier. And my question is, easier for who? The other thing that I've been returning to again and again is, why does this moment remind me of 2016? Why does this exact political moment remind me of 2016? And I think it's because in 2016, at the beginning of the year, I was living in Seattle and I was thinking about leaving Seattle and I was disillusioned with like labor work. And I was like, fuck nonprofits, fuck this whole fucking nonprofit industrial complex, which I think unions can fall into. But around that time, what was it? Hillary Clinton was running, Bernie was running, Trump was running, and everyone was so afraid of Trump and also thought he was a joke. And living in Seattle, by that point, I'd been an organizer for a good 3 or 4 years, and I understood the point of grassroots organizing, and I understood how mainstream politicians, once they get into office, once they get to a higher position of power, they will always throw their people under the bus. Like, look at whatever. But at the time, I lived with all these white people and they would always say like, you need to vote third party, you need to vote Bernie. Like, why the fuck wouldn't you vote? Like, that's so disingenuous. And I would always argue with people like, one, I don't think the act of voting means as much as people say it does. Like, in terms of our historical struggles for political autonomy and legibility on this land, like, yes, Black people fighting for voting rights was literally an essential part of our self-determination. But I don't think it's where our self-determination should end. And I think it's only like maybe even a halfway point, because in my mind, ultimate Black self-determination means like we aren't a part of America anymore. Like we're no. What really bothered me is that people that weren't as invested in long form grassroots organizing were telling me that by not voting, I didn't care about harm reduction. I didn't care about other people's rights. And my thought was, most of the white people or the people at the time telling me to vote for Bernie don't organize now, don't engage with things politically. And so what that shows me is that when a politician comes forward that represents some sign of progress or progressivism to people, whatever they define progressivism as, it also means that after they vote for them, they get to sit down and wait for that person to enact all of the things that grassroots movements and mass mobilization movements literally fight for. And what made me uncomfortable with Bernie is that even with the whole third party thing, like I do think we deserve a political system that should have more parties. I think there should be even more than a 3-party system. But even with the 3-party system model, we're still operating within a logic that agrees with, like, if you're voting and then a politician goes into office, unless you're fighting them on all the issues that they claimed that they were going to do and they didn't, you essentially just voted someone into office and then let them kind of have free reign. Or maybe you'll show up to 1 or 2 protests over their 4-year term. Like, I think when people encourage others to vote for green candidates or third-party candidates or Democratic candidates that seem a little bit more progressive or maybe a little less punitive or just like a little less fascistic, I think it's people saying, oh, if you vote for them, things will get better. But what I think the actual solution is that we have to ensure that things are better for ourselves, for other people that have less than us, regardless. And I think that people want more progressive candidates in office because it means that we as regular citizens, as the masses, have to do less work because we have a government that spins the illusion of progress. How can or should the public forgive politicians for their messed up and punitive policies of the past? What does justice for punitive measures and violence look like? And this is kind of the deeper question I have. I don't think we deserve to vote politicians in office whose motives we don't actually trust, whose logic we don't actually trust. The Kamala Harris response to the protests at Congress is literally the prime example. For 9 months, people all around the world have been protesting the ongoing genocide in Gaza. And now that you're getting closer to the presidency, this is the time for you to be releasing statements to explicitly call these protests unpatriotic. And so to me, the closer you get to power, the more you have to align with the status quo. And what I read underneath that statement is Zionism is literally an American logic, and we have to defend that. Or at least that's what Kamala Harris wants us to do, which is not what I'm going to do. It's just kind of like, oh my God, I want freedom for Palestinians. I want freedom for them. Justice or repair looks like us not needing to ignore someone's wrongs in order to buy in whatever illusion of progress that they can spin for us. What justice actually looks like is for reparations to be given to all of those people that were unjustly locked up by Kamala Harris's prosecutorial strategies, by her role as an attorney general, by her role as a DA. What reparations for these punitive measures looks like is that we maybe have a candidate that demands a deep structural dismantling of how our prison and carceral system works. I resist this idea that voting for Kamala is harm reduction because there are real reasons why people don't like her. People don't like that she talked shit on Biden about supporting policies that upheld educational segregation, yet then she became his VP. People are against the fact that she literally has worked for an arm of the state that operates to criminalize people. And there is literal records, policies, articles written that show this history. And yes, you can argue that she has given lip service to how some of these policies were bad or how she would have done them differently, but the damage has been done. A really bad ask of like American citizens, of people, is to tell us like, oh, they're a good person. Like, you just have to trust them. Like, just wait and see. Wait and see. I was waiting and seeing, and then Kamala Harris released that fucked up statement about the protesters who were protesting war crimes. If there's anything that I can offer as ways forward, possibilities, solutions, one is one that I actually saw online earlier. For the liberals that are criticizing leftists for being skeptical of Kamala, or the liberals that are saying that we're throwing away our vote, or we don't care about black women or queer people or XYZ, your solution is to push Kamala Harris to be stronger on all of the issues that leftists and far leftists are demanding, whether that be a legitimate end to the genocide against Palestinians and not a cheap or vapid call for a two-state solution, because this two-state solution still falls in line with the Israeli need to displace Palestinians. It doesn't negate this history. Kamala to be even more for abolition, for structural reform of our policing and prison system. If there are things that people that are farther left than you criticize Kamala Harris for, how can people that support Kamala actually push her to be more progressive? Or the second solution is that we say, fuck this, I don't need to vote, we're gonna do what we need to do regardless, which is organizing, building co-ops, building processes of mutual aid, looking at communal forms of de-escalation, raising resources, creating our own alternative forms of media, building consciousness so that when the next election season comes around, maybe we are more prepared to present a three-party candidate, or maybe we are more prepared to be ungovernable in terms of what the system can do to us and how the state can enact violence on us. And for me, the ultimate solution is the latter, because I don't think working within Americanism or electoralism is really going to give us the future that we need. I think if anything, it's part of steps 1 through 10 of like an 80-step process to have a liberated world or a post-capitalist world. And I just know myself, regardless of who's in office, there's going to be repression against activists, against revolutionaries, against people that resort to political dissent to make their voices heard. Cop cities are going to continue to be built in this country. More money is going to be funneled to police. And we really have to ask ourselves, if someone who has a history of being a prosecutor, a DA, an attorney general who released all these punitive measures is going to be president, what the fuck do you think they're going to do when people are going to be protesting over the next 4 years?
Donald Trump, on the other hand, has been talking a big game about securing our border, but he does not walk the walk. Or as my friend Quavo would say, he does not walk it like he talks it.
in this conversation about what leads us emotionally and politically to the reality of our electoral system, our democracy, there's a lot of things. Those things include the hierarchical placement that Blackness has in our country, in our globe. It has to do with all of the needless money in politics and how marketed a system of democracy when actually it requires millions, if not billions of dollars to sway politicians to do what corporations want. Most of us don't even understand US and American history to the point where we can actually describe the complexity of the violence of what the US has done. Can we actually talk about the War on Terror? Can we actually talk about Hurricane Katrina, Flint, Michigan, the Trail of Tears? Nazi Germany and Hitler's concentration camps were based off of things that the US was doing.
The use of disinfection facilities as well as chemicals like Zyklon B would later be adopted by the Nazis.
And when we don't make very critical and specific connections about the cyclical nature of violence in the US, we are doomed to repeat it. How many coups we have bolstered, and to claim that we have a democracy and that there's a lesser evil for us to pick. There's also another fallacy built into what we're being asked to participate in. And that fallacy is essentially, in this situation of Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, the lesser evil and the weaker adversary argument. There are two very different political choices that I think are at hand. We can either have a democracy where we actually are voting for candidates based on the fact that we agree with most of their policies, or we are voting because this candidate is not as bad as the other candidate. And for me as an abolitionist, for me as someone that has seen the violence of the US government, of imperialism, of colonization, to vote for the lesser evil is voting for the lesser colonial evil. But it's still fucking evil. If we're being asked election after election after election after election to vote for the lesser evil, vote for the person that's going to be a weaker adversary, when is the actual point that we decide that the government isn't actually there to represent us? It's actually there to control us. And if it's there to control us, we have to figure out how to organize, be militant enough, and create alternative political structures, governmental structures. And the question of how we liberate ourselves is deep, entangled, and it's not something that I can really articulate in this video, but I think there's many different paths forward. There's the path forward where we lean more into liberalism and we eventually have a liberal repressive government that is still shutting down human rights or performing xenophobia, but it's in a more lighthearted or more progressive way. They're changing the language to make it more marketable. Or we can have a conservative government where they lean into more domestic repression, they lean into more xenophobia, ethnocentrism, and that is a more overt fascism that I think people also militantly have to resist. Or we have the option where organizers, the masses, reach a certain level of consciousness where we choose not to engage in the government or we build viable alternatives. I think all of these things could potentially happen at the same time. But I think the utility of organizing is to continue to experiment now so we can begin to build the structures and processes that can help us get to a better world. And this dichotomy of telling people like, you need to vote for Kamala because like these states, you're telling me to vote for a politician that's going to be harmful to certain kinds of people because they won't be as harmful to you. And when I think about the American individualism, the American exceptionalism in that, I wonder what would our electoral system look like if more Americans voted based on our foreign policy, based on whether or not politicians would actually give humanitarian aid abroad, intervene on genocides, do the conscious political thing on a global level. What would happen if we voted for politicians that were 10 toes down on that? Do we have any politicians that actually represent that kind of approach to war crimes, criminality, violence? A candidate that I would maybe be able to support is one who would maybe be talking about reparations, one that would be talking about of scaling back the number of jails and prison systems, one that would be talking about releasing X amount of prisoners by X amount of time through this very concrete timeline. It would be someone who would maybe understand the social issues related to raising a family in the US. Is there therapy offered to children? Is there more maternity leave? Do we need more protections at work for parents? Should there be more after school programs? How can you invest in art programs in poor communities? All of these are solutions that we can push for on a grassroots level, and I think we should. The reality that people are expressing with Trump, if Trump gets into office, like there's going to be so much repression. People are going to die. People are already dying under Biden. Organizers, activists, Tortuguita, a revolutionary who was unalived by the state, who was unarmed, for protesting. Cop City, for protesting this kind of myth that the Democratic Party is a weaker adversary is only truly there if we're willing to have a militant response, which I think a lot of the people arguing towards Kamala and saying that it's the lesser evil is that crowd ready to organize militantly against Kamala, when I believe she will inevitably fail to call out various forms of police brutality or really stick up for Black people when they're rioting in response. I doubt that she will shut down cop cities or make a really great case against them. I also doubt that she is going to be as progressive on the border as she claims to be, because there's already speeches that said she's going to continue certain aspects of Trump's border policies. And to have a Black woman as a representation of imperialism is a sinister twist and turn. And it's almost like this system locked us out before throughout most of its history, but now that we're allowed in, we're supposed to be buying into it. How many fucking years of this country's history has it locked out someone like me? So why would I want to participate? Why don't I want something better for myself?
Mike check. I will not vote for candidates that have sent millions of my people to prison. I will not vote for a fake democracy dependent on myself.
Wait. I agree. If I had sent millions of your people to prison, or she had, that would be good. Hillary didn't vote for the 94 crime bill, even though Senator Sanders did. And neither one of them were trying to send millions of your people to prison because there were or in the federal prison system. And she was the first person in this campaign who said we ought to do something to change the incarceration policies. And she was doing it. No one else has done that. Well, facts are difficult there.
Once I saw the news about Kamala Harris in Michigan being disrupted by pro-Palestinian protesters, I knew I had to talk about it, because if you dig deep into my YouTube channel's history, you would know that in 2016, I disrupted a Bill Clinton speech when he visited my college town in Athens, Ohio. The news has come out that in a Michigan rally, Kamala Harris was giving a speech and that speech was disrupted. And if you watch the video, Kamala Harris basically does the like, I'm speaking. If you want another Trump presidency, just say so. I loved when this news came out, because the point of this political disruption is to expose a contradiction. And when the news comes out, it forces people to say, oh yeah, like disrupting a boring old political speech makes sense, especially when our government has given millions and millions and millions and speed delivered bombs and other shit to Palestine and built a port and wasn't able to do any kind of real aid for Palestinians. It makes sense that people are so angry that they don't want this event to run as usual. And then there's the people that say, oh my God, like, they were being rude and like she was giving them grace by even being there, and this is not the way to win your issue. How do you stop a genocide when your government is supporting that genocide? How do you win that issue? Arguably, you win that issue by making demands of your government, by making those demands visible. And when those demands aren't met, you righteously oppose operations, processes, the status quo. Because disrupting the status quo is necessary to expose to people that your normal isn't the same as someone else's normal, and your normal shouldn't be at the expense of someone else's suffering. Disruptions like this, they also expose a kind of American exceptionalism or a kind of American isolationism, which I think election years always kind of turn me towards. I usually get so angry because instead of people engaging with the full scope of issues, whether it be domestic, international. And that means like how our government can sow violence against us, how our government passes laws and policies that hand monies to the elite, how we have our resources drained from our communities, whether it be health, education, they funnel militarism in our communities. All of these things occur. And when election years roll around, it's always about how can we save ourselves? How can we help ourselves? When if we were to vote based off of an analysis of politicians, off of what they're willing to do to other places abroad, what they're willing to do in terms of political intervention, in terms of being complicit or aiding in other genocides, if we just voted off of that alone on a militant and deeply structural level, so many people wouldn't vote for politicians. These disruptions, I think, expose the more militant edge of trying to hold these politicians accountable. And the other side of it is that there were so many different angles and ways that Kamala Harris could have responded. Kamala Harris could have said, hey, why don't you come on stage and let's give you the chance to express yourself. Kamala could have said, this is a complicated issue and I understand your frustration. Since this is the Palestine issue, we have to consider deeply, like, how seriously do we understand Kamala's demand for a ceasefire? Or is it just kind of lip service in the way that liberals and progressives do in order to not totally align themselves with settler colonial genociders? It's like, that's what the US is. But I pulled up an article from the Palestine Chronicle that says pro-Israel policy, will Kamala Harris continue on Joe Biden's ticket? And this is from just a week ago. And this reads, according to Kamala Harris herself, her connection with Israel began at a young age, stating that having grown up in the San Francisco Bay Area, I fondly remember those Jewish National Fund boxes that we would use to collect donations to plant trees for Israel. The Jewish National Fund's tree planting program works to cover over Palestinian villages that were ethnically cleansed between 1947 and 1949. On top of this, during her passionate speech she delivered in 2017 to AIPAC's Lobby Annual Conference, she praised Israel through and through, even go as far to compare the civil rights movement in the US to the creation of Israel. Harris has been one of the top recipients of funding for pro-Israel lobbying groups, with some tallying up her total donations to be around $5.4 million throughout her political career. Even that, I'm just like, someone please, someone please. I keep saying someone needs to save us, but we need to save ourselves. With all of this in mind, there is the deep question of how will people continue to hold Kamala Harris accountable? How will they speak to the fact that, and I think the way people react to disruptions just really shows their imagination around what is politically possible, one for themselves, but for other people. If you're against a disruption, you're probably against a riot or a work stoppage, or maybe even people sitting down at counters and protesting integration, because anything that is a disruption of the status quo is seen as not respectable or being too militant or violent or confrontational, when actually, if you look at the US compared to other parts of the world, socially, we try to work with things as they are, which I don't think is how it should always be. And I just really hope moving forward that people continue to do actions like this to expose the many different contradictions at play, and how politicians suddenly, when they're reaching a new level or height or significance, they can be marketed to us in a different way. When I think, what has Kamala Harris said about the fact that Palestinians are being essayed by IOF officers? And there's literally images and video of this that have come out recently. What does Kamala Harris say about the fact that literal tent cities, schools, hospitals have been bombed by Israel, that there are countless war crimes that have been documented? And for us to say we're the greatest democracy in the world, does democracy not intervene when torture, suffering, war crimes happen? I bring up this illusion question because it really is what drove me to disrupt the Bill Clinton speech that I did in 2016. I want to take us back to 2016. This was around the time that I was maybe a year out of college. I lived in Seattle, had a labor organizing job, hated it, left Seattle, went to work a job in Wyoming, experienced all this racism, came back to Ohio, started working an election job. That election job sucked. I was overworked. It was like 50 hours a week, quit, went to Standing Rock, and I came back. And around this time, Bill Clinton was campaigning for Hillary Clinton because she was running against Trump at the time. And Hillary was never my savior. I remember all of the news and understand and have studied the war on drugs and understand Bill Clinton's complicity Or not even complicity. Bill Clinton's active hand in the war on drugs and locking up poor black and brown people. There have been drug dealers in my family. There have been men in my family that have gone to jail. And the conditions that the U.S. sows abroad leads to people wanting to immigrate here, leads to people coming here undocumented or not, getting degrees or not, working legal jobs or not. But there is this deeper question of, how does the U.S. account for the structural violence that it sows abroad that eventually comes back to itself? It accounts for this by responding with criminalization, by using these bodies for profit. And this to me is so clear, and it's also emotional. And I have a longer video that I'm going to release about why being against electoralism matters to me on a deeply personal level. And I'm going to talk about all these different experiences in my life that I've had, because I do want this channel to be a very deep political analysis, but I also want us to analyze emotionally and intellectually with how we engage with politics. And growing up with a stepfather that was in prison and experiencing all that stigma and the fear and dealing with all these other things, and growing up in a city where criminalization of black people was just normal, you start to feel like the world doesn't give a fuck what happens to you or people that look like you. So why should you care about the world? But what made me care about the world was, I'm queer, I'm black. I want to be an artist. I want to live. I want to expose things. I want to be honest. And I want my anger to mean something. And so when Bill Clinton was coming into my town and all these people, I was just so fucking angry. And I got a group of my friends together. I remember I asked like 20 people if they wanted to disrupt. Only like 4 people said yes, because everyone else was too scared. And then our plan for the disruption was, we're going to go in, we're going to disrupt in succession. So one person is going to disrupt, get kicked out, wait a little bit, another person is going to disrupt. So there's staggered. You disrupt more of the time and space. We had quarter sheets that we're going to read off of. I was the first one to disrupt. Immediately, people in the audience were like, let Bill speak. I'm a black man in America. Let me speak. And they started walking me out because I was like, okay, I'm not getting handcuffed. And they started walking me out, and I kept yelling as I left. And the thing that is burnt into my head is how many people looked at me in shock or confusion, and how weird it felt, and how I kept thinking, why aren't all of you doing something too? Why does this or something else not matter enough for you to do something too? And I went to a nearby building where I stashed some extra clothes, changed my clothes, went back to the speech. Got in. Staffer grabbed my arm. He's back. Ended up getting kicked out again. Is that the other people I went with didn't disrupt in a way that actually disrupted the event, so they were never asked to leave. Like, they said like, oh yeah, we started chanting a little bit, but nothing really happened. And I'm like, did you yell loud enough? Afterwards, I had people telling me they were worried for my safety. And I was like, worry for my safety? What did I do? Nothing. I had people like sharing it online and like telling me how proud of me they were and blah, blah, blah. I also had people that came up to me like a year or two later and would say, I was there and I was kind of wishing that someone was going to do what you did. And I'm thinking, why didn't you do what I did? Really, really taught me. It was a big moment for me in my personal radicalization journey, because I think it was the first time that I wasn't in an organization or I was also like in a group setting where I pushed the line of what I wanted to be possible because it was personally important to me, and for other people, it wasn't as important in that way. And this isn't to say that the people that didn't disrupt were cowards or whatever. I do feel some type of way about it, but it is what it is. And I think I learned the importance of where I need to stand my ground, and how, because of what I've been through, because of what I know to be true, because of what I know to be true about the violence that this state enacts, this makes sense to me. It might not make sense to you, but it makes sense to me. I grew up in a city where my brother would get stopped all the time driving back from work at like 1 a.m., where you weren't allowed to go into the downtown area because the police at the mall would stop you and wouldn't let you in, where you walk through metal detectors in schools, where you don't walk around with your earphones and your hoodie up because of what happened to Trayvon Martin. And this reality of suffering, I think, is we're marketed the more beautiful version of it, the democracy, every fucking 4 years. But I keep thinking, what about 2020? What about Standing Rock? What about Occupy? What about the student encampments? What about all these movements that are trying to demand a better world? And when a disruption happens, all a politician can do is say, shut the fuck up and stay over there. What does that tell you about the world that we live in, about the political system that we're asked to vote for and participate in? It's about complicity, saying that I'm proud of my 2016 self for doing what he did then. I'm proud of myself now for continuing this work. I still organize. I'm going to be organizing for the rest of my life. I know that. And I hope that this video, the things I post, that it's not just something that you keep on YouTube in this box that is the internet, that you actually look at your life and you think, what makes me so angry that I'm willing to talk to other people around me and to organize around it and to try to change the material conditions of that? And I think a disruption, it's about exposing the contradiction. And I think the US and our political system asks us to ignore so many contradictions, when those contradictions, if we were to actually look at them, would tell us more about ourselves, about the country that we live in, and what place we have in the world in terms of not being the good guy, not being on the right side of history, not being the utopian democracy that we claim to be. When we are voting here as US citizens, I wonder what we're actually fighting for. Being able to dictate our playing field, trying to set up the right conditions. But I think the act of investing and voting and believing that the government will give us our rights and believing this narrative around the credibility of a state to determine who is human and who's not. I would be at a loss if I didn't finish this video by also mentioning that on August 10th, 2024, US approves $20 billion in Israel arms package. The State Department on Tuesday cleared the sale to Israel of dozens of fighter jets and other military equipment worth over $20 billion. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken approved the possible sale of F-15 jets and equipment worth nearly $19 million. The package also includes tank shells worth $774 million and combat vehicles worth $583 million. The tank rounds would almost immediately be delivered. The Boeing F-15 fighter jets would take years to produce and deliver. And I'm going to be as real as possible when I'm saying this. If we're investing in a blue kind of logic or a democratic future, are the Democrats going to oppose this? Because these weapon sales are set to continue years into the future. This is meaning that 2 or 3 or 4 or more years into Kamala Harris's presidency, if she does win, Israel will be funded by the billions of dollars in terms of weapon sales. And this is what I mean. When we're voting for ourselves, we're voting for our rights, when we're voting for the things that we need that are going to help us, that when we're voting to save ourselves, we're also voting to have our tax dollars go towards literal genocide. And if we don't have a praxis around how we plan to oppose this genocide, how we plan to expose weapons companies, Boeing is one of the top 7 contractors with the Pentagon in terms of the aircrafts that it offers them and the weaponry that it offers. It offers kits that adjust missiles and drones and bombs that you would normally have to have like a human being like operating these things. They have kits that can easily adjust these things. So you can just drop bombs anonymously on civilians or what Israel claims to be Hamas. And this is what makes me sick about the whole narrative about vote for the less evil, vote for the weaker adversary. Is this still the weaker adversary for Palestinians, for Congolese people, for people that come from colonized nations that the US is actually actively funding their subjugation? How seriously I take abolition and how it's tied to all of these expanded and intense forms of militarization on a global level. What I ask of the Kamala Harris supporters, of the people that are going to vote blue so we can have better conditions, how the fuck are you going to oppose this? Are you going to be out in the streets protesting? Are you going to be targeting weapons manufacturing companies? Right now, where I live locally in Ohio, the Boeing 5 case is currently happening. In March of this year, a bunch of people went to a weapons facility here in Ohio and they protested. They performed a work stoppage. 5 people were arrested. And those people have dealt with the prosecution, asked them to take down private social media posts. Boeing at one point threatened to charge these defendants with $300,000 in restitution. And this is on top of the fact that Boeing has been a company that has been aligned with Israel literally from the beginning. Google Boeing in Israel and you'll find a PDF of this company bragging about this shit. And these are the kinds of companies that our government, our administration, our politicians are just in the background funneling money towards, yet they want to purport to us that they care about humanism and human rights. We can't just ignore for our own safety or our own idea of a democratic safety, because in the end, they go after them and then they're going to go after us. And it shouldn't even matter if they're going to go after us because they're hurting other people. Our state, our government, the Republican Party, the Democratic Party is hurting people in other nations. And I wonder where our sense of international solidarity is, because I think this is the kind of key that will push people in the US and the West to do more than what they need to do to save themselves under a narrative and a system that has been played out for them again and again and again.
Eating the cats, eat the cat, eat the cat, eat the cat, eat the cat. They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating.
The New York Times, he complained that the 15,000 Haitian immigrants who received visas in 2017 all have AIDS. In that very same meeting, the Times reports, he said that once the 40,000 Nigerian immigrants given visas arrived in the U.S., they would never go back to their huts. The White House denies this report.
The Post reports that according to two people briefed in the meeting, the president asked, quote, "Why are we having all these people from shithole countries come here?" referring to African countries. In Haiti, the president then went on to talk about how they needed to bring in more people from places like Norway.
When I see people dance online and make jokes of it and make light of it, I don't think these same people are reading the news. I don't think these same people are intaking the literal material political violence that is happening in Springfield, Ohio right now.
It's just to mean discrimination and xenophobia and bigotry and racism.
How scared are Haitian immigrants in Springfield after hearing former President Trump's claims?
They are scared for their lives. Some of them are asking me, even yesterday I got a friend calling me asking me if he has to leave because he's scared for his life. So another friend told me that it seems that he would have had some family coming to visit him, but it seems that he gonna welcome them in Columbus or Dayton because it is not safe right now for him in Springfield to welcome his family here.
What do you make of these claims? What does it feel like to hear politicians make these false accusations?
It's very shocking and sad at the same time, especially coming from people seeking the high office of our land, high-ranking people. I think they should do better. They have everything at their disposal to check the veracity of anything that they hear. They say that they are high-educated people who attended great university. I mean, they know how to check something to see the veracity of it. And
like, seem like I'm coming down on the immigrants because it's the people that's bringing them down here. Because wherever they're at, that's what they're used to, bro. They're in the park grabbing up ducks by their neck and cutting their head off and walking off with them and eating them. Like,
in the last days alone, there have been numerous bomb threats in Springfield, Ohio. Haitian families have had threats made against them. Schools and buildings and public institutions have had to close down. Proud Boys are entering Springfield, Ohio. And the reason that it's so telling to me that I worked so hard on my last video and even already it's getting a lot of traction, I think we do need to have a deeper conversation around fascism, around how we make light of state violence and political violence, and how we often don't name it as critically as we should. And this video is going to be for anyone that is interested in unpacking the memification of US politics, people that are interested in the ways that the US public tries to distance themselves from political violence while making light of that violence. And it's going to be for people that, as my mother and a lot of other Jamaicans would say, who want to pick sense from nonsense. My name is Prince. I'm an author. I make video essays and content online about writing, about anti-capitalism, about Black anarchism, about James Baldwin, Black culture. And I'm on vacation in Italy, and this is a loud porch. So if some of this audio is off, please excuse me. Why this specifically pissed me off so much is that I was born in Ohio, but my family is from Jamaica. So my parents immigrated to the US in the late 70s. My mother, when she came to the US, experienced the ravages of desegregation and busing. For those who don't know, that was a strategy from white supremacists and people that didn't want to end segregation and didn't want to integrate schools to instead bus black kids from black neighborhoods to white schools and do vice versa for white kids. So instead of integrating and making education fair and equal, they decided to just bus people to another institution and expose them to prejudice and racism and all sorts of, I think having an immigrant mother who especially is a single mother, I think having a family that has experienced all kind of carcerality to the point where I literally wrote a book about my life 2 years ago titled When They Tell You to Be Good, about my family's kind of journey to the US, about the different modes of masculinity in my family, how that's led to different conceptions of carcerality that my family has experienced. And when I watch the debates and all of the fear-mongering and discourse and disinformation about immigrants and criminals coming to this country and murdering people, and all of the fear-mongering around violence and why we need to be smart on the border and smarter on crime and all these other things, I can literally look at my family and see either side of the aisle. I see women who came here, were undocumented for a number of years or not, held down jobs, raised families, sent them to public schools, and did all of the things that the American dream demands of you. All these different forms of assimilation while also trying to hold on to your home culture. There are also people in my family that have gone to jail, have been deported, have been undocumented, have come back, are the image of this illegal immigrant coming in that the news wants to weaponize so much for the sake of white supremacy and fascism. And I see my family as my family. I don't see them as a political talking point. I don't see them as something that the elite should use or justify to use more carceral force or to fund more border patrol or fund more police. And on the topic of this disinformation, I think one thing that's very telling in this whole debacle is that the Facebook post that this whole eating dogs and cats rumor came from someone in Springfield, Ohio, that shared a Facebook post and has since apologized. But this person says that they're mixed race, that they're part of the LGBT community, that they have a black daughter. Fuck that. Fuck that. So being mixed race means that you can't spread racism, xenophobia, disinformation. It's embarrassing. Lee told NBC News that she never imagined her post would become a part of the national conversation while also spreading conspiracy theories and hate. I'm not a racist, she said, adding that her daughter is half black and she herself is mixed race and a member of the LGBTQ plus community. Everybody seems to be turning it into that, and that was not my intention. Intention is different than impact. And it's really fascinating to me to be at these intersections, to be the product of this idea of the American dream, while also within my lifetime very clearly understanding anti-blackness, understanding colonization, getting radicalized, and writing about it, organizing about it. I've been a grassroots organizer for literally the past 10 years. I don't just post stuff online. I don't just write. I do work in my community as much as I can wherever I am. And I keep returning to the question of, why is it so important for the American public to memify political violence instead of resisting? Why is that the kind of first kind of point that people go to, especially online? And I think the more that I've posted online, done these video essays, done my podcast, the more people follow me and demand answers and solutions in my comments or praise the things that I say or do. I've really been thinking a lot about the pros and cons and the dangers of politicization online and how social media and politicization through the internet as like the main means of engaging with the political world that we live in, engaging with capitalism, imperialism. I see a lot of dangers in that because social media is run by corporations. Corporations are swayed by political and economic incentives, and the attention economy makes it so that people can make light of things when ideally we would be having nuanced conversations about Donald Trump, Kamala Harris, the role of the border, the role of immigration, the function of xenophobia, the many different ways that it shows up. And literally in my last video, I talked about how xenophobic violence is an expression of fascism through many different lenses, but especially a necropolitical lens. And now we're looking at the fact that a debate happened, Trump spread misinformation, and then now we are seeing fascist bomb threats literal threats of danger happening to migrant communities in Springfield, Ohio. And I'm currently reading a book right now that I picked up at the beginning of this trip that I'll recommend for folks out there that want to read more. It's called The Brief History of Fascist Lies. And one point that that book makes that I think is extremely useful is that it talks about how fascism demands a political system that sees quantitative truth as less valuable than a primal truth that is based not exactly in logic, but more in a leader that has some kind of deeper knowledge about the world and is able to impart that onto the public. And it also notes that fascism also demands action. It demands violence as a way to legitimize itself. And if we look at this situation right now, we can see that happening. Trump spread disinformation, and now his followers or people that want to say the things or think the things that he's saying are resorting to political violence in Springfield, Ohio. And my question is, will the state protect these people that are having threats made against them? Local community members protect these people? Will the people dancing online to these fucking remixes of Trump literally spreading bullshit about immigrants, will any of those people protect these Haitian immigrants, any of these immigrants that are being threatened in Springfield, Ohio, or elsewhere? And I think when people make light of these things, they ignore the fact that you're laughing at political violence that doesn't affect you in the same way that it affects these people that are having threats made against them. So I want to dig into a few things in this video, but we're going to be talking about the memification of US politics. What are some examples of this that we can see in our current cultural landscape? And I'm going to share some thoughts that I am leaving this kind of moment in time and space with, especially with voting only a few weeks away and the results of the 2024 US presidential election on the horizon. First, we should describe what a meme is. A meme is an image, video, piece of text, etc., typically humorous in nature, that is copied and spread repeatedly by internet users, often in slight variations, an element of culture or system of behavior passed from one individual to another by imitation or a non-genetic mean. People have made a remix of that sound clip from the debate. People are dancing to it, especially the gays are loving it. And I'm thinking, are any of these gays going to fight for Haitians or other immigrants or West Indian people when they are under attack? Probably not. Because do you remember when 2020 happened and Trump won and all the white people that were around you, if you're a person of color, were just like, I'm really upset I can't talk about it. I think the same fucking thing is going to happen again. But recently I went to a conference in San Francisco to do a keynote speech, and there was a really, really interesting session about the far left and media, and there were a bunch of things that were synthesized. But I remember one particular conversation that was had was about how far right uses memes and meme culture like NPC to kind of assert their politics. They use it as a recruitment tool, a way to legitimize different processes of state-sanctioned or extrajudicial violence. It was really interesting for me to hear this conversation because I have friends that dig into far left groups, and they monitor them and they kind of figure out what these groups are doing to kind of document and see what kind of events they're going to be holding in certain spaces ahead of time so they can inform the public anti-fascist organizations to show up and oppose the far right or fascist organizations that are going into communities to sow dissent and make people afraid and or to literally harm people. Was that a number of years ago, around the time that Trump came into power, the alt-right started using more memes to kind of express their political ideology. And eventually the non-playable character became a central point of discourse amongst the alt-right, where they would say, like, in video games, the non-playable characters are the people usually relegated to class-based positions, the clerk in the Pokemon game, or the person carrying your stuff in a fantasy game, and how in the alt-right perspective, so many of people in the world are basically like non-thinking flesh bags that exist to support the function of institutions and are basically just like mindless people not aware of the matrix, and how this is a problem for the far right because these people are parroting woke language, they're going towards progressivism, they're basically destroying this white fragile society that has been created. And now the far right even more is using this as a reason to denigrate entire populations of people, to legitimize like public acts of violence, like white people going into public spaces and committing mass violence, like we've seen in different schools and different public settings, and how it's become this sort of recruitment tool for the far right. And there are different ways that the alt-right weaponizes memes and NPC, and they use it as a recruitment tool. And what was really scary and telling about this talk that I went to is that some of the people giving this talk were saying, like, the far right is really good at using the internet, at media, at kind of just using memes in general to reel people in. And it can be as easy as, like, you might see a meme and think it's funny, and then see another meme that's similar, and then a week later you're suddenly listening to Jordan Peterson and talking about how trans people shouldn't exist, and literally being a TERF, and how when we use humor online, it becomes a slippery slope because we don't always realize what we're politically engaging with and how serious the ramifications of what we're engaging with are, especially when the attention economy, when algorithms, when rage farming is such a thing that can feed the algorithm and then give people social media success. And there are countless examples of mass shooters or vigilantes performing public acts of violence because of xenophobia, because of racism, and literally in their manifestos referencing NPCs or meme culture or these far-right media images that are used to denigrate the populations of people that this violence happens to. I've already been thinking about the memification of politics in general, and it really, really just opened me up to the idea that while people are being politicized online, there is also this dichotomy in space online where we have to be careful about what we're engaging with, what we make light of, because it can easily be used as a tool for the other side, which is why we have to speak clearly, why we have to define what state and fascistic violence is, and why we have to really get angry when it's time to get angry. And for me, as a child of immigrants, as someone that grew up watching my mother experience various forms of xenophobia, as someone that literally lived in Jamaica for 2 years when I was age 3 to 5, so technically I lived there, even though my memories are very sparse, but it was a very impactful period of time. The notion of immigration is deeply important to me. It's something that people do to escape the violence that colonial powers, colonial entities like the US export abroad. And I take this really seriously. And I think on the other side of the coin, aside from how the right uses memes and social media, the more centrist or progressive aspects of the American public use memes, and how it can be really, really dangerous and pacify us into a future where we're just literally handing our rights over, and we joke about it along the way, or we try to find humor in xenophobic violence. I got radicalized in 2014 when the Black Lives Matter movement popped off, and obviously Twitter, social media platforms were a great way for people to engage in the movement. Live streams were a big way for people to learn about what was happening in Ferguson or in the Arab Spring or other movements that were happening around that time, and citizen journalism kind of got on the rise. But I think with the advent of social media apps like TikTok or the short form content or even YouTube going on the rise again and again and again, it's become interesting over the last 10 years to see how the internet has increasingly become a space for people to rage farm and or to engage politically. And I think from the Western standpoint, it makes sense. But I think what I worry about with internet politicization is that we see online activism as our main means of political expression. And I don't want to denigrate anyone who's found like a platform or a way of speaking to these things. I don't want to say that people that speak online are only online pundits or talking heads. Like, I think there are so many things that people don't see on the internet, just like in my life. There's so many things that I do politically that for security culture reasons, I don't fucking talk about it on the internet, and I probably never will. I didn't even write about some of that shit in my book. And it's interesting because I think with the front-facing nature of internet politicization, there is so much that is missed on a nuanced level, and there is so much that is reduced for the sake of likes, views, comments, and engagement. I mean, just look at the whole Be Better controversy when he switched from talking about internet influencers and celebrities to talking about Kamala Harris and how people are like, you're Canadian, you're not even like a political scientist, like what the fuck are you talking about? Shut the fuck up. And when I look at memes and how they're utilized, I think about how George Bush was president, was with other politicians and pushed for the war on terror and made lies about weapons of mass destruction and went into Iraq and Afghanistan and literally went in and militaristically intervened and killed countless civilians. Guantanamo Bay was created by Dick Cheney, who is now endorsing Kamala Harris. And George Bush was the face of this. I mean, the war on terror went on for literally over a decade and was heavily criticized by countless people. And now George Bush gets to be this cute older man who's a painter and crushes on Michelle Obama and is sweet and oh my gosh, and he's not a war criminal. Or Michelle Obama has all these beautiful blowouts and she's so funny and cool and she's a girl boss. Yet she also is the wife of Deporter-in-Chief. Obama is this cool man that shares these playlists and has a great book club, but he also denigrated Baltimore protesters after the police murder of Freddie Gray. One of the functions I see of the memification of US politics, it's to defang politicians. It's to erase the very real war criminal history. It's to erase the very real xenophobic violence they have weaponized throughout their careers. It's to erase the ways that they corroborate, are complicit in, or literally benefit from war profiting, and to make them cute, to make them fun, to make them interesting. And I think the defanging aspect of it is interesting as well for me personally, because I remember when I was living in Seattle in 2016 and Bernie Sanders was running, and a lot of people around me were like, why don't you vote Bernie? Like, he's a great option. Like, what do you mean? And blah, blah, blah. And people were just really mad at me. And I remember that year, it was like post Black Lives Matter. And I was like working this organizing job that was shit. And I was just like really disillusioned with the way that institutions can use social justice in order to reel people in. And I would just tell people, like, I don't like that we're memifying him and making him cute when I think we need to be critical of politicians. That was kind of my entryway into this whole thought process. And it's only developed more and more and more. And I think some of it is just for me naturally. I am skeptical of anyone that will take on the label of politician, because I think our current political system as it stands places politicians above regular citizens, and it says like, oh, they're people that are more versed in the political world, they're more willing to engage in what the electoral college is or US imperialism or whatever the fuck. And I think I don't want someone to represent me, and I don't want to buy into the idea that someone else knows how to govern or lead way more than I do. Like, I think governance and how we should engage and shift resources in our communities and protect each other should be a communal act. It shouldn't be handed to a certain number of individuals. That's how you create a power imbalance that then necessitates money or people that have certain qualifications. And I think it's really dangerous, especially in a system like the US, where you can demand all of that on one side, and then someone who is white, mediocre, racist, sexist, vile, like Donald Trump, can just swoop in and literally be the literal expression of white mediocrity and still be able to reach one of the highest political positions in this country, if not the world. The defanging of politicians, I think, is really dangerous, because when you can make jokes or make cutesy images or girl boss Kamala Harris online, you ignore the fact that this is a person that existed and worked within the carceral system, that wants to be smart on crime, and is literally just saying the same shit as Trump about the border. So what is the point of defanging politicians? It's to make it easier for us to not be angry at them. I think the other utility of the memification of politics is to find humor in the terror of the system that we live under. And I understand some of the need to find humor, but what I don't understand is when people don't deeply politically engage in their communities and the violence that is happening around them on an organizing level, on an individual level, on a community level, but then they engage with making jokes about it online or using it for the algorithm or using it to get more followers, likes, to monetize the suffering that is happening all around us. And finding humor in it is sometimes a way for us to cope. But I also think certain modes of coping are an expression of our privilege and should be rightfully called out. I don't think these jokes are funny because I grew up going to hair stores with my mom and being followed around because we were Black. I grew up with people asking her, oh, where are you from? Like, where's your accent from? As soon as they met her, and her telling me it felt really reducing to be asked where you're from immediately when you meet someone. I have seen so many different forms of political violence on a xenophobic level happen since Trump, and that mobilized me to get deeper into anti-fascism. And I've done that kind of work in the past. When people find humor in something, I wonder how close their connection is to the communities that are being joked about, who have disinformation spread about them. And if people aren't in community with these people, but can still go online and make jokes about it and then not step in when this political violence or extrajudicial violence happens, is that not a form of complicity? Is that not a form of participation? If you're dancing in a video that is a remix of Trump joking about immigrants, and then that same video is sent to someone in the alt-right and they think it's funny, they're like, ha ha ha, like, you see, like, Trump did something cool there and we just got to keep doing this. Like, do you get what I'm saying? Like, when you're dancing to something, you're almost giving it permission and you're saying that you think it's funny. Is it funny that bomb threats are being called into schools in Springfield, Ohio? Is it funny that Haitian families are not sending their children to school? Is it funny that the government will not step in and offer any kind of material like solution? Is it funny that there are no checks and balances on a governmental level to the point that anti-fascist groups have to step in and anti-fascists have died throughout the history of fighting fascism while regular citizens sit at home and make jokes about it? It's not funny. Other functions of the memification of US politics that I see is that it's a procrastination before we reach the point of anger. Like, I think sometimes when things shock us, we're like generally shocked, we're left speechless. Sometimes we are made to, it makes us sad. And sometimes we want to laugh. And sometimes it makes us angry. When I watched that debate, I think one of the reactions I had in terms of like how Kamala operated, like, I think Kamala did an interesting and legible job in terms of opposing many of Trump's points. But when I was watching her as a child of immigrants, especially a West Indian immigrant, a Jamaican dad, my family's from Jamaica, the measured response that she had wasn't enough for me. Kamala, you better throw hands. Oh wait, you're a part of the empire. You're not going to throw hands. You're just going to sit there and do what you need to do to not look like the angry Black woman, when you actually should probably be fucking angry. Things get worse if more state violence or extrajudicial violence or fascistic violence happens. Who's going to step in? Who's going to be angry for immigrants? Who's going to be angry for undocumented people? Who's going to be angry enough to do something? When we procrastinate a justifiable anger or response to political violence, to fascism, to xenophobia, we're literally handing over our communities, our country, our nation, our futures, because we want to find some kind of temporary humor or solace, when the far right is planning months, weeks, years ahead. Project 2025 doesn't just exist in terms of next year. It has been in the works since the existence of the US as it stands, for centuries. And how do we resist it? Is it by laughing online, finding it cute? Or is it by naming it as xenophobic violence and fascism and speaking out and taking care of your communities, starting to document what alt-right groups are coming through, organizing people that are ready to go into Black Bloc and to protect people in their communities that might face violence because Donald Trump spreads this bullshit and it gives people permission to go out and harm people. I just want to end this video on reminding people that it's important how we react when we're facing fascism. It's important how we articulate the dangers of the system that we live under. It's important that we say we shouldn't be laughing, we should be resisting by any means necessary, whether it's the state deploying the xenophobic violence, or whether it's far-right groups deploying the xenophobic violence, or it's corporations deploying the xenophobic violence. And I think it's really dangerous when we use humor to pacify ourselves while the world burns all around us, while someone else's world burns. So much of what Palestinians are demanding is that the West simply pay attention, that the West put pressure on their institutions, that the West give up some of their privilege. And I ask, if people are demanding that for Palestine, if people are demanding that for Congo, can people demand the same for migrants, immigrants, undocumented or not, in the US, in their local communities and other communities around them? Angers me is that I think most of the people dancing, laughing online aren't going to do shit when the violence really, really arrives. Most of those people laughing, joking, and dancing, I wonder if they're political organizers. I wonder if they come from immigrant families. I wonder if they care enough about their immigrant family's experience to step in, to speak up, to do something. Or are they so unfolded to the empire that they can find humor and solace in going online and dancing to a beat? When I go back to Ohio, I'm going to figure out what community is doing, and I'm going to figure out how I can step in big or small ways. And I'm going to try to figure out how I can help, how I can use some of my privilege, how I can acknowledge these things and be angry about it. I think anti-fascism can show up in a variety of means. We can be anti-fascist on a media level. We can be anti-fascist on a community organizing level. We can be anti-fascist on a militant level. And the responsibility of citizens that aren't exposed or impacted by the xenophobic violence is to figure out where on the spectrum you want to be when you're resorting to anti-fascist work. And joking online is literally the opposite of it. It's permissing a logic and then remixing it and then finding humor in it. It doesn't make any sense. And the last thing I'll end this on, for everyone out there, whether or not you find this funny, are you going to pull up to protect people that are going to face xenophobic violence? Are you going to pull up, or are you going to sit in your home, watch TV, and watch people engage about it online? Find ways to resist. That's literally all I can say.
I see America through the eyes of a victim. I don't see any American dream. I see an American nightmare.
Felt really important to have another fleshed out conversation about a sort of political idea that's been synthesizing in my head and is very clear to me. But in a recent conversation, I once again realized, oh, we all come to our political processes with different definitions of commonly used words, but these different definitions don't mean you or I are necessarily wrong. We're coming from different perspectives, but these different perspectives begin to matter when we're dealing with electoralism, when we're dealing with billions of dollars being funneled towards nations that are committing genocides, and when we're during a year of increased political dissent, fascism, electoralism, and everything in between. And I want to start this conversation by one, thanking everyone for watching my videos in the past. If you haven't, go and check those out. There's plenty of videos that kind of synthesize other topics. But recently I was in St. Louis for a writing event, which was actually, it was a really cool writing event. It was a radicalism and writing conference. But at this event, I ended up talking to someone who was also a longtime organizer, older than me. And we started talking about like our theories of change, and this person was a labor organizer, and I was kind of talking about my experiences in labor organizing and how it kind of dissuaded me from that work, at least with the experiences that I went through. And we kind of hit a hard point where he was basically asking me like, oh, what's your theory of change? Like, you have all these ideas and blah, 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 but like, what is your theory of change? And I started to explain it. And then and then I got to the part where I was like, oh yeah, and the state is fascist. And he was like, wait, roll that back. What do you mean? And I was like, the state is fascist. He started debating with me about it, and then he got into a discussion with my comrade about organizing and what fascism could look like, and it just evolved into this conversation that was both difficult. We also challenged each other. I felt like I got to speak very clearly about this idea, which means a lot to me, and no one can really like sway me from, both because of my own life experience and my political understanding. So this video is going to be for folks that are disillusioned with the current state of politics, that don't believe that state-derived solutions to liberation or human rights or civil rights or human rights violations as like a viable long-term solution. And for people that really take abolition and anti-fascism really seriously on numerous levels and want to have a kind of contemporary conversation about what that looks like, especially in terms of the US, of the violence that the US commits here and exports abroad. So let's dig into this conversation. If you haven't liked, commented, and subscribed, please do. Consider becoming a channel member to get early access to these videos, or consider joining my Patreon, where pretty soon I'm going to start reading chapters of James Baldwin books. I'm probably going to read 1 or 2 or 3 chapters a month and share it on there, so you kind of have access to an exclusive kind of audiobook library of James Baldwin, which will be really cool for me to do since I am really digging into James Baldwin. First, I need to do a quick revisitation of the Democratic National Convention, which recently happened this August. It was over the course of 4 days, 8 hours a night. And I watched one night of it all the way through, but the other nights I definitely kept up on the news and tried to research and learn as much as possible. But the night that I watched, it was just, the DNC was a fucking dumpster fire. And I know if you go to the mainstream news, you'll see all kinds of things like, oh my God, like the Chicago police showed restraint and there was so much joy, and Oprah spoke and Michelle Obama, and oh my God, Bill was there. You mean super predator fucking fear-mongering Bill? And there are plenty of things that bothered me. But if I can synthesize the main thing that bothered me about the DNC, it was the Democratic Party's willingness to resort to not only dog whistles that would align itself with right-wing talking points or Republican talking points, but it was about the legible goal at the DNC for the Democratic Party to make itself more appealing to centrists and or Republicans. And there are some great TikTokers out there that talked about this, but there was one TikToker.
We are willing to vote for her if she gets an arms embargo and a permanent ceasefire, but that's too much.
Go watch the full video before you leave a comment on this video, but that's the take. That is the take right there. The Democratic Party is obviously trying to appeal to moderates and Republicans more than they're trying to appeal to Democratic progressives and everyone else on the left. And we can see this not only through the words, but through their actions as well. When Kamala Harris gets on these stages and says that I'm going to make sure that we have the most lethal military in the world, Donald Trump talks big about securing our border, but he doesn't talk the talk or walk the walk. That's how we see it through their words, and we can see it through their actions when they don't let an uncommitted movement speaker speak at the DNC stage, but they let Israeli hostage families speak on that stage. They let cops, Republicans, and former Trump officials speak on that stage. And I know folks got excited over Tim Walz being her VP pick and all the false hopes and promises, but this was to be expected, and I'm glad that the Democratic Party has stopped trying to LARP as progressives, and they're showing folks who they truly are.
Bernie Sanders on stage and then putting a billionaire after, not allowing Palestinian delegates to speak at the DNC, but allowing families of Israeli hostages to speak, bringing out someone like AOC, who has in the past been ardently against Biden's complicity with Netanyahu and Israel, to now speaking at the DNC, parroting the Democratic Party's language, and also taking selfies with Biden. People who are in Senate and Congress who are their peers, who have folded to the current goals of the Democratic Party, which is to spin a message of joy while in the background our government is selling $20 billion worth of weapon sales to Israel, which will happen over the next 4 years. And there are a few moments that really got me. Of course, so Michelle Obama spoke at the Democratic National Convention, and one of the points that really rubbed me the wrong way was that when she was talking about how bad Trump is and how racist he is, and basically how Kamala Harris is this great candidate, she said this.
Who's going to tell him that the job he's currently seeking might just be one of those black jobs, those black jobs, one of those black jobs, those black jobs, one of those black jobs, those black jobs, one of those. Who's going to tell him that the job might be one of those black jobs, 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 one of those. Who's going to tell him that?
But even that is to my point about the memification of politics, about Brat Summer, about how Bernie Sanders was memified, how warmongering presidents like George Bush, who led the war on terror, after he is president, can be seen as this adorable artist who's just has an innocent crush on Michelle Obama. And so we have a constant problem in US American politics where we need to memify or defang politicians to humanize them in order for us to have a viable emotional connection. But what we should really be understanding is that just like social media is there to drain our data and use it for advertising dollars, the mainstream US political system is also wielding social media to spin a narrative that politicians are just regular people like you and me who might be a little bit funny or weird or dorky, but they should be admired, right? Right? Run my clip about Kamala Harris laughing about smoking marijuana every once in a while after actually locking up people for marijuana in the past.
Now, Senator Harris says she's proud of her record as a prosecutor and that she'll be a prosecutor president, but I'm deeply concerned about this record. There are too many examples to cite, but she put over 1,500 people in jail for marijuana violations and then laughed about it when she was asked if she ever smoked marijuana. She blocked evidence that would have freed an innocent man from death row until the courts forced her to do so. She kept people in prison beyond their sentences to use them as cheap labor for the state of California. And she fought to keep cash bail system in place that impacts poor people in the worst kind of way.
Are these politicians or people? So the black jobs comment really, really bothered me, especially because I was just thinking like, Michelle, you talked about how the White House was built by slaves. Like, not only are you stacking on these contradictions, you're using them and trying to say that Kamala Harris being a black imperialist is like a sign of progress, which I think generally was my problem with the DNC. I mean, even Kamala Harris got up on stage during her speech and said, I defend Israel's right to defend itself, and we're going to have the most lethal military in the world. Go online and look at any of the side-by-side comparisons of Donald Trump's speeches where he talks about the military and that speech by Kamala Harris. They are using the same talking points. And this is what I find frustrating when people say like, oh, Kamala's progressive, like she had the Back to Track program and she did all these other things to like criminalize like sex offenders and sexual predators and all those things. And our reliance on the criminal justice system to respond to violent crime isn't a justifiable reason to ignore all of the extreme, horrific, racist, and anti-poor violence that our current carceral system commits. It's not an excuse. And I think this is what is interesting about when people think about Kamala. They think she's smart on crime, like she wrote a book called Smart on Crime. And my question is, why can't Kamala be smart on genocide? Why can't Kamala be smart on foreign policy? Why can't Kamala be smart on the border? Why can't she be smart on any of these things in terms of humanism? And that is the real question. And my answer to that is she doesn't need to be smart on those things, because if she's smart on violence and repression and all of the things that aligns with the status quo, she will ascend to the amount of power that she currently has right now. And that is the sacrifice that she has made as a supposedly progressive politician. All of these discrepancies with the DNC, whether it be all of the parroting of progressive language like join the movement or be the change or we're not going back, weaponizing legitimate radical black history to tell people to vote for a commander-in-chief who's just going to be another black imperialist. All of the social and political mechanisms that the DNC were deploying leaves me with the assertion that the state is continuing its fascism. It's just giving it a different face. It's giving it a more disguised form. It's making it a black Asian woman. It's making it all of the older black people in that audience whose faces could be used by mainstream media to corroborate a narrative that this is actually progress. But it's progress for who, as I've stated in other videos? Progress for us as Americans, as black Americans, as people that are worried about our livelihoods and civil liberties here to vote for Kamala Harris? Or is it liberation for people abroad, where if we used our privilege and actually opposed fascism, opposed the various forms of repression that the state reliably turns to, whether it's Republican or Democrat, then we would be in a very different political scenario right now. First, before we dive into everything else, I want to dig into some of the basics of the terms that we're going to be using in this video. Fascism, repression. Since I really love this body of thought, and I was actually talking about it a lot this weekend, we're going to talk about necropolitics. Woo, woo, woo. Give me a thumbs up in the comments if you remember me talking about necropolitics before. And first, what is fascism? Fascism is loosely defined as a far-right, authoritarian, ultra-nationalist political ideology characterized by dictatorial power, forcible suppression of opposition, and strong regimentation of society and the economy. And if we look at each of the things that this definition defines fascism as, we can see it on both sides of the aisle. Characterized by dictatorial power. In my mind, dictatorial power is any kind of power structure that uses political force or repression, exploitation to incentivize people to agree to a certain kind of punishment. Forcible suppression of opposition, that falls under the definition of repression as well. Think of Quintel think of policing, think of the RICO charges against those who have been opposing cop cities in various parts of the country. Think about the repression against the Standing Rock movement and so many other movements, or the mainstream media's reliance on denigrating repression and how Democrats or liberals or progressive denigrate more militant or violent forms of political action. Strong regimentation of society and the economy. This is definitely something that is more leaning towards the right-wing side of things, but when I look at the war profiting that has happened under the Biden administration and the current deals that are being made to send more money to Israel to militaristically and economically align ourselves with Israel, I definitely think of the regimentation of society and the economy towards the purpose of militarism, towards the purpose of protecting our borders, towards the purpose of xenophobia, which you can say that Kamala Harris has pushed and stood 10 toes down on, especially since she has been running for president of the United States. Just look at her fucking speeches. Just look at it. Is disturbing. I want to bring in George Jackson, who was a famed Black revolutionary who wrote works like Blood in My Eye and Soledad Brother. And George Jackson is a really important political figure for folks to like remember and understand and read up on. He had a very close relationship with Angela Davis, and I find him to be very fascinating as someone that was able to synthesize the evils of American empire. This comes from a piece called Analyzing the Correct Method in Combating American Fascism. And it reads, co-optation thing is a mechanism of the American brand of fascism. We have to understand that first, in essence, how it works is that each group, each social unit, larger than two, the powers that be, will approach the element that's guiding that social unit and attempt in some way, and will get possibilities. There are thousands of ways of approaching playing on loyalties, or let's say the money thing, the money syndrome. We've had that trained into us from infancy, or they'll attempt to show us the futility of our actions, and then perhaps, if that doesn't work, they'll explain to us how actually our goals are the same as theirs. They're not such bad guys after all. And if it worked, it's worked in the past. You've heard the stories, the tales of white America and the establishment being able to deal with Black nationalists. Well, they have been. They've built foundations, the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and so forth. They bought them off. How do we stop those things from happening? As far as I'm concerned, our dialectic, our intentions, our goals are so mutually exclusive to those of our opposition that I can't see anywhere we can find anything to agree on. And we have to stop it right from the beginning. In other words, no acceptance of tokens, none whatsoever in the building of the people's world. We do it on our own. We do it with our own facilities. And to say that we can't do it, to say that we don't have the personnel, that we don't have the financial means, is just like saying that producers can't produce, that bread markets can't make bread, and we don't need them. That's the whole point. We stop them by barring them completely from our program. We can't limit ourselves to any one particular form of struggle. But I'm saying that the people who are given the responsibility of deciding which facilities that we'll take and use of our own for the building of the infrastructure for our own, I think that these people should use extreme caution and always bear in mind that the underlying motive is tokenism, and at all times be cynical. Take yes, but take in the spirit of reparations and reparations only. I love that he synthesizes these things in different ways, because there was recently an episode of Olay and Friends. If folks haven't watched Olorinati's channel, they're an amazing political thinker and abolitionist. And they talk a lot about our current political landscape. And I've been on 2 of those episodes, and there was recently an episode that I watched actually after leaving St. Louis, where there were so many amazing points made about the uncommitted movement. If you look at the DNC and what the Democrats and progressives who align with the Democrats right now are really doing, they're using movement language to make people feel inspired in their space. All of the calls for hope, all of the calls to a more radical history, how we fought for so much, how we aren't going back. Not going back for Black people means that the ultimate emancipation from the Black liberation perspective is death, is resistance, is burning down the fucking plantation. So how can that language be used during a Democratic National Convention where Palestinian delegates, Palestinians who are experiencing a lot of the same, if not a deeper sense of militaristic carceral violence, and have used those experiences to not only support Black struggles here in the US, but this has been a historical thread line between Black and Palestinian communities to use the language of revolution and resistance and movement work at the DNC while committing that kind of erasure is fucking ridiculous. And that to me is a very insidious form of fascism in line with this definition by George Jackson.
Really, it's best not to think about the consequences of our actions over there, especially given the theme of the week.
I can feel the excitement in this arena. It's filled with energy and with joy. The air of joy.
Joy. Joy. Joy.
We will be joyful warriors. The president of joy. Let us choose joy.
Oh my God.
What fascism can look like through the anti-Black lens, because when I was talking to this person in St. Louis, I was saying, like, the police are fascist. The state is fascist. Our military is fascist. Being anti-poor is fascist. Spreading propaganda, using military resources and nationalism and patriotism to denigrate entire populations of people in the name of social order and the status quo is fascism. And if we look at global anti-Blackness and the way that the US operates as an expression of fascism, we find a few qualities that make sense. First is the dehumanization of Black people. Fascism relies on dehumanizing Black people, casting them out as dangerous or criminalizing them. And these practices look like slavery. These practices look like Jim Crow, like mass incarceration, like our current battles against police brutality. And when I say the dehumanization of Black people, I think about it through the Afro-pessimist lens. Like, you can dehumanize Black people through negrophilia, which is a fascination with Blackness, a romanticism of it to the point that you dehumanize it, or negrophobia, which is when you actually fear Blackness or you criminalize it or you denigrate it and you make it something less than. And we can see that throughout pretty much every part of social life in our world, right? State-sanctioned violence. The state uses violence, including police brutality and surveillance, to maintain control. And we can see this through the historical understanding of what slave controls are. We can see it through the police murder of Sonia Macy or Tyree King or Tamir Rice, or any of the tools at the state's disposal to lock Black people up with next to no reason. I mean, I think of Khalif Browder, the Black teenager in New York that was locked up for years, for months, over a stolen backpack. Another way that we can look at fascism through an anti-Black lens is economic exploitation. So the wage theft, the discriminatory lending, the fascist policies that rob Black people of opportunities. Think about Donald Trump resorting to housing discrimination. Think of all the current opponents to affirmative action that say it sways the scales in another direction and favoritism. Affirmative action was brought in because there was literally legalized discrimination against Black people. Redlining, about the way that police stop people from entering certain neighborhoods, about how gentrification operates as a form of economic violence. And through all of these lenses, I view the state as fascist because our state is inherently anti-Black. And you can use plenty of other lenses. You could use the lens of xenophobia, of being anti-poor, of being anti-LGBTQIA, of being anti-woman, anti-trans. If a government can legalize and legitimize various forms of violence against human beings, that to me is a force of fascism that we are seeing deployed all the time, and the US just is really good at innovating it.
Where do you sleep, Jerome?
In this bed.
You have this big bed?
Yes.
What happened? How did you get that hole in that bed there, Jerome?
Rats.
The what?
Rats.
Now, Jerome, you are taking care of Kathy, of Beulah, and Lois.
Yes.
Now, are you going to give them lunch today?
Yes.
What are you going to feed them?
Almost.
Do you have any food here to give them?
Yes.
I see. And what time did you come out the field this morning?
6 o'clock.
What time would you get home?
About 3:30, 4 o'clock.
6 this morning to 4 o'clock this afternoon.
That's right.
How much did you earn?
$1.
$1?
That's right. $1.
Is that because the beans were of poor quality?
That's right.
Has this happened before?
That's right.
How much will your food cost you today?
About $2.
Aileen, how old are you?
29.
How old were you when you first started working in the fields?
8.
You've been working 21 years in the fields?
That's right.
Aileen, do you ever think you'll be able to get out of this kind of work?
No, sir.
Another definition that we should be aware of is repression. Repression is when the government resorts to a series of processes, propaganda, or funding resources in certain directions to dissuade dissent, to force a certain kind of isolationism, or to literally use the legal and carceral system to lock people away for expressing their human rights and their civil liberties, like protest. And I want to bring in a very clear kind of explanation of this. If I think the most clear example that we can look at it from the US perspective is COINTELPRO.
December 4th, 1969, when Chicago police raided his apartment and shot and killed him in his own bed. Black Panther leader Mark Clark was also killed by police in that raid. Authorities initially claimed the Panthers had opened fire on the police who were there to serve a search warrant for weapons. Evidence later emerged that told a very different story. The FBI, the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, and Chicago police had conspired to assassinate Fred Hampton.
But COINTELPRO did things like wiretapping prominent figures in the civil rights movement, following people, sending false letters between people, sending infiltrators into organizations that would be there for months, if not years on end, actually bankrolling people to infiltrate organizations and do illegal shit that the state would then target these organizations for. Watch Judas and the Black Messiah. Read about the murder of Fred Hampton. Read about the murder of Malcolm X. Read about any slain person in the civil rights and the Black Power movement and the anti-war movement, and you'll begin to understand and get a grasp of what COINTELPRO is. If you are far leftist now, or if you're someone that is into anti-repression or understanding how to do that work, COINTELPRO is one of our biggest historical references for understanding how counterinsurgency works, how repression works, and how it can come in various forms. And for those that do movement work now, you might know of the phrase security culture, but security culture is a series of behaviors to protect yourself from state surveillance and to not necessarily fearmonger or sow paranoia, but to make sure that people in your organizing spaces only have the information that they need to know, and that unnecessary information about political actions or things that are happening isn't shared unnecessarily in spaces where they don't need to. That's why when I talk about revolution and revolutionary processes and other thoughts and ideas online, when people comment and they're like, well, you're just complaining, you don't have a solution, what's your solution? I'm like, do you want me to talk about revolution in detail on the fucking internet? It doesn't make any fucking sense. You need to choose your language carefully in terms of security culture, because who you're around should dictate what kind of information you're sharing and whether or not it's relevant to them. And we can even look at COINTELPRO and the modern manifestations of it. I mean, think about the Trump administration and their call outs of Black identity extremists and putting them on the FBI watch list and saying that they were a danger to national security and identity. These are just people that were organizing with the Black Lives Matter movement. Talk about the relevance of necropolitics. Necropolitics is a term coined by the philosopher Achille Mbembe, referring to the power and capacity of the state to dictate who may live and who must die. It involves the use of social and political power to dictate the fate of individuals and or groups. Necropolitics is especially relevant when analyzing the US state through the lens of fascism and anti-Blackness, as it provides a framework for understanding how the state uses death and violence to control the population. And necropolitics to me is really where I can begin to like really understand if I look at the different functions of the state. Like the state isn't really there to protect our human rights. The state is there to protect property, to reinforce the status quo and social order, and to protect capital. Human rights is usually at the bottom of that list. Like there are times and instances where you could be like, oh yeah, like, but think about sexual assault. Think about domestic violence. Think about the racial biases that we often criticize police for having. All of those biases lean more towards a necropolitical kind of way of the government and US politics operating, but how, from a necropolitical standpoint, even in the afterlife of your death can still be used as a form of state and social violence. I think about the villainization of Black bodies after they're killed. I think about how the media portrays Palestinians as terrorists and not human beings, but gets to portray Zionists as human beings or people that don't go into Palestine and SA people and then get celebrated in the media on Israel news and broadcasting. Like, if we look at our world through the lens of what is death making and what tries to oppose these forces of death, we can begin to kind of have a framework that allows us to more clearly understand who the enemy is to liberation and Black liberation.
I stand here in the spirit of my sister who fought for justice until her dying day for my father, standing outside protesting. She called the CCRB to do this investigation, and they didn't do their job. We called the Department of Justice. They didn't do their job. So no, I'm going to stand outside and I'm going to scream it. Pantaleo needs to be fired. He needs to be fired. So no, we will not rest. No, we will not be calm. De Blasio, what's up? When are you going to fire this officer? So where's the justice? Don't apologize to me. Fire the officer.
There is the very serious question of, how does fascism show up in our current world and political system? And I have a few examples that are just kind of very relevant and clear to me. But first is the US's reliance on militarism and militaristic intervention. I literally was researching this earlier and I pulled up an article, it's a video that explains that the US has launched 251 military interventions in other countries since 1991. And since 1978, listen to this number, 469 military interventions since 1798. And these military interventions, just read the history, some of them have literally led to Al-Qaeda. Some of them have involved us literally being a part of the Iran-Contra scandal. Some of them have literally involved the war on drugs. Some of them have literally involved intervening in freedom and decolonial struggles in other nations while we're claiming to be the greatest democracy in the world. What was Vietnam? How much of the US's reluctance to intervene in certain kinds of global crises is based on economic incentives in terms of trade deals and what kind of industries we want to be tapped into and what nations align themselves with that. And when we think about the justification for militaristic intervention, we can remove it from colonialism and settler colonialism. I mean, literally, Manifest Destiny was the logic that colonizers used to come to North America to burn and destroy land, to spread sickness to indigenous people, and to erase their culture, to perform violence against them, all sorts of violence, and to literally kidnap and extradite them from the communities that they have lived in, and then to continue to do that for hundreds of years. It's why a land back movement exists now. Why does the US need to give so much money to its military? Why is this so necessary? Who are we protecting ourselves from? And how many enemies have we fucking made in this world? Like you go and intervene in a country and you disrupt their decolonial process and you don't think that'll revolutionize people and have them form militias where they might want to oppose the violence of the US and their complicity in other violences? The US's reliance on militarism and the advent of slavery into slave patrols, into segregation, into our current prison industrial complex as we know it, we can look at the advent of cop cities, which is happening right now all around the US.
I will close with reminding you of the stakes. Tortuguita was a warning shot. Rayshard Brooks was a warning shot. Jimmy Atchison was a warning shot. Katherine Johnson was a warning shot. Anthony Hill was a warning shot. Scout was a warning shot. Alexia Christian was a warning shot. Jan Robinson was a warning shot. Oscar Kane was a warning shot.
Time's expired.
The state has shown us their hand, Atlanta.
Time is expired.
They've shown us what they would pay for war.
Thank you.
What would you
Time is
pay for
expired.
freedom?
Thank you.
City down south in Atlanta. His name was Tortuguita, and I just want to have a moment for folks to understand how serious that is, how it's impacted literal communities in the US that are opposing cop cities right now, and how this is a form of violent repression, if not fatal repression. There's a website called Is Your Life Better or Are You Just Going Along? And they have a entire page breaking down the different cop cities. And even if we're just looking at the map, there are close to, if not more than 36 cop cities either currently being built or proposed around the country. Cop City would be one of the largest militarized police training centers in the country, all built by clear-cutting Atlanta's largest green space. And these cop cities cost millions of dollars. You should probably look up your city or state and figure out if there's a cop city being built there, because I know even here in Ohio, there was one being proposed in Cleveland, and I'm not even sure if it's actually going to happen or not. A part of my own immense cynicism around Kamala Harris and wanting to vote for her and wanting to ignore the role of criminalization in the forms of fascism that the US deploys and anti-Black violence, we can look at like Chicago and see that Lori Lightfoot was a politician who's a Black woman, queer. When Black people are put up in high places, especially when they have attachments to different arms of the state that have performed anti-Black or carceral violence, that makes them palatable to the system, because to white supremacy or white hegemony or imperialism, they're doing things that align with the ultimate goal of fascism or carcerality. They're using the tools of the state to dissuade dissent. And what would it mean for someone like Kamala Harris, who is a former attorney general, a former DA, someone who has various elements of progressive history, but at this DNC showed that she can parrot the literal militaristic language and violence of the Republican Party and the right wing in order to seem a little bit more palatable to people in the center. And what I really think and worry about with cop cities is that instead of the National Guard being called into cities when the next wave of mass mobilization and protests happen, these cop cities are going to have the infrastructure and resources to do that kind of damage without necessarily having to call the National Guard in. And they're going to be able to innovate technology. They're going to be able to hold conferences and bring in all sorts of speakers, maybe some more IOF people coming in different cities around the US to train those police forces. And so the advent of cop cities, I think, are very much a very real expression of all of the possibilities of what repression can look like in the US. And there's another website that I pulled up, and it says that in terms of cop cities, there has been discovered evidence of 69 related projects, and there are 3 states in the entire country without any plans for a cop city. Can you imagine, like, you don't need National Guard coming in, like, they're just gonna build a cop city. Where are the cops gonna live? They're probably gonna live in your neighborhoods with you. Do you want a cop living next door to you, riding their bike to their fucking cop city? It's terrifying. It's actually terrifying. It's actually terrifying. When I think of carcerality as a force of anti-Blackness, it's literally there to like remove Black people from communities and erase them. And maybe that's like a loosely necropolitical function of carcerality. It's like to remove us and destroy our internal lives, even though I don't believe being incarcerated means your internal life is destroyed. I think it very much still continues, even though the carceral system does perform physical and psychological violence. But I think about Hurricane Katrina and how this was one of the first events in my mind where I really realized, like, oh, our government doesn't give a fuck about us, and they will lie, and those lies will lead to us dying. I'm gonna read from Toward Freedom about some of the impacts of failures of our governmental system to react. Hundreds of thousands of evacuees scattered far and wide. According to the Data Center, an independent research organization in New Orleans, the storm ultimately displaced more than 1 million people in the Gulf Coast region. And this is not to forget that Hurricane Katrina, a lot of the decimation and damage that happened was because the levees broke, and those levees were near communities that were extremely Black and extremely poor. So the need to actually fix the things in the city that were going to protect these people in this kind of situation, it wasn't really needed because those people to the government were not important. And it's maddening that I saw this when I was like 10 or 11, and I didn't have all of the language to synthesize why it enraged me, but now I do. And I feel bad that we still live in a world where these kinds of violences and atrocities will only continue to happen because of, guess what? Climate change. It's only going to continue to happen. I think of the consistent expression of xenophobia in the US, regardless of the party, as another form of fascistic violence. And there are so many examples that you could think of. You could think of Japanese internment camps, you could think of the Trail of Tears, you could think of Trump calling other countries shithole countries, or locking families up at the border, separating families. You could think about Obama as deporter-in-chief. But I want to break through one of the recent examples of the US's historical xenophobia that has led to literally one of the greatest violations of human rights. If we look at the US's xenophobic policies, we can see that one specifically led to inspiring some of the policies of Adolf Hitler's administration and the Holocaust, and that is the gasoline baths of 1917. The 1917 gasoline baths at the US-Mexican border were part of a disturbing public health campaign launched by American officials to prevent the spread of diseases, as they say, like typhus. Quotation. You know how I'm putting quotations up? This is why they said they did gas baths. This process involved using noxious gases such as gasoline and kerosene to delouse Mexican immigrants crossing the border. The treatments were not only degrading but also dangerous, as evidenced by a tragic incident in 1916 where a fire at the El Paso City Jail caused by a lit cigarette someone was lighting a cigarette during gasoline baths. One of the workers in there lit a cigarette during one of these gas baths, resulting in the death of 27 people. This incident led to the infamous bath riots of January 28, 1917, where Carmelito Torres, a 17-year-old Mexican maid, refused to undergo the disinfection process. Her protest quickly grew into a larger demonstration involving thousands. Understanding and seeing these methodologies used by the US government, and that inspired, to some degree, gas deaths that occurred during the Holocaust. And the reason that this is so important to bring up is that we can't ignore the specifics of the violence that the US has committed here historically and then wrap them up and just say that our government isn't violent, our government isn't fascist. If you actually read like a lot of US history, a lot of our policies that have been based in xenophobia or scapegoating other people is literally about the dehumanization of other people so that it is more legible to commit violence against them, to erase them, or to just literally kill them off. And that has been the through line of USA politics and policies, no matter what side of the aisle that you're on. I mean, I even think about like, why were the Democrats opposing abolition? Or why were the Democrats opposing like blacks getting their voting rights? I thought the Democratic Party was about humanism. I thought they didn't want to go back. Oh God, the gas baths.
We were evicted last minute, about an hour and a half ago or so. And this is how militant we are. This is how organized we are. I don't think that they realized how this is a whole movement for the relatives. The city sweeps, they evict people. They displace them when county workers, when outreach workers know where they're at so that their housing doesn't like advance. There's so much criteria, I guess, that they need to get housing. They need to have their ID. They have to be on assistance. They have to have their birth certificate. They have to have no warrants. These are things that workers are able to come and pick them up and go take them to make sure that their benefits are done. Take them to the DMV. Meet with, their different DOC or like probation officers and stuff, judges, to make sure that their warrants. So many people don't have warrants here because they've been taken care of. Camp Nanakasi is no evictions. Let us be placed so we can house as many of the relatives that we can. We can help the relatives get off to treatment as they're ready.
This is something from the Supreme Court that came out early this summer, June 20th, 2024. The Supreme Court says cities can punish people for sleeping in public places. The article reads, in its largest decision on homelessness in decades, the U.S. Supreme Court today ruled that cities can ban people from sleeping and camping in public places. The justices, in a 6-3 decision along ideological lines, overturned lower court rulings that deemed it cruel and unusual under the 8th Amendment to punish people for sleeping outside if they had nowhere else to sleep. Writing for the majority, Justice Gouch said, homelessness is complex Its causes are many, but he said federal judges do not have any special competence to decide how cities should deal with this. But advocates for the unhoused, the article goes on to say, says the decision won't solve the bigger problem and could make life harder for the 250,000 people living on the streets, in parks, and in their cars. Where do people experiencing homelessness go if every community decides to punish them for their homelessness, says Diane Yentel, president of the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And this goes on to say that the decision allows cities to restrict when and where people could sleep and even shut down encampments, but they said that cities first had to provide people adequate shelter first. There's a challenge in many places that don't have nearly enough shelter beds. In briefs filled by local officials, cities and towns also express frustration that many unhoused people reject shelter when it is available, but they may not want to go if the facility bans pets, for example, or prohibits drugs and alcohol. This decision, I think, is part of a larger logic in the US, which basically says that if you don't work hard enough, if you don't have the resources or the things that people in a lower class or middle class position have, it's your fault. You didn't pull yourself up by your bootstraps, without understanding the vast array of substance use disorders in the US, without understanding the vast array of domestic violence that leads to houselessness or housing insecurity, or the fact that we're currently going through a recession, we are going through a pandemic, and that exacerbates the ability for people to find jobs, to keep them, and to have stable housing based on where they live. Automatic criminalization of the poor, or seeing it as just something that fix our social order, it signifies a deeper logic in the US, which says, like, if you don't have what it takes to be a citizen, or the kind of citizen that we believe you should be, then you don't deserve to be here. You can be relegated to death. Think about the fact that when temperatures drop in the US, there is next to no protection for people that are outside and maybe drug users and aren't allowed into housing shelters or facilities. And the fact that we have policies that say that certain kinds of people deserve help and others don't, that in itself is inherently an anti-poor, incarceral, and punitive logic. We are doing a special break in this episode to talk to someone who is a lot more versed on housing organizing and that area of radical change.
My name's Sam. I'm a housing organizer and mutual aid organizer, and I do work with the First Collective and Stop the Sweeps.
In the organizing work that you've done, how have you seen unhoused people be dehumanized or relegated to being second-class citizens?
I mean, there's a lot of different factors. I think maybe the first thing that I've come to understand is that our state only chooses to prescribe value to people when they can produce value from their labor. And so everyone who might potentially not be able to do that is relegated to carceral systems of violence. And so that's policing, that's poverty, that's prisons, amongst many other things. That's also like health, like your access to health care, your access to like nutritional food, with homelessness specifically also being relegated to sweeps, which is like displacement. Yeah. So that's kind of how I view it in terms of a class positioning, and then also how society views your value based off of what you can produce. The police stop homeless people all the time, charge them with soliciting, charge them with other small offenses. When people don't have money and they're charged with misdemeanors over and over again and can't make it to court and don't have the resources to actually function within the legal system, the only solution is jail or prison. Either that or becoming more maroon to the society that you live in. So being pushed further into displacement and homelessness. So I think that is kind of a function of how the police interact with homeless people in general, and sweeps are a function of that. Huge amounts of police show up to sweeps and arrest people consistently. I've definitely experienced at a couple different camps that I've been to, people talking about how there are sting operations at camps often, where they'll do like a pull everyone out of their tents and then check everyone's background, and if you have warrants, they will arrest you. Unhoused people don't really have rights to defend themselves against police brutality. in a lot of ways because their existence is often illegal just based off of how they're living by necessity. How I think a lot of people talk about it and kind of what we're trying to demonstrate in a lot of interviews that we're doing with people, especially who've faced a lot of like state violence through sweeps and displacement and arrests and mass arrests, kind of trying to have them articulate themselves like what that actually means for them instead of, you know, me coming up here and kind of demonstrating that. But I feel like the police's role is whatever the police want it to be.
And I take us all on this journey to really assert the point that fascism and fascistic violence and state violence comes in a variety of forms. But we have to remember that these forms are there to categorize certain populations of people as less than, to institute processes or institutions of violence that can regularly go into communities, whether here or abroad, to commit those violences and to uphold a status quo that says that certain kinds of people deserve to live and other kinds of people deserve to die, whether it be through literal government intention or government negligence. I think either of those things should easily be put under the category of fascistic violence. And we have to look at what the US government says versus what it does. At the DNC, the message was about hope and change and having the most lethal military and caring about a two-state solution and a ceasefire. But look at where the money is. Look at how much money AIPAC has funneled into this election to make sure that certain kind of candidates are more viable and certain kind of candidates might lose. Look at all of the different disinformation being deployed against candidates that have more progressive stances or ideologies. Look at the fact that $20 billion, once again, I will say $20 billion, was just sold to Israel in the form of weapon sales, which will continue through to the next 4 years. I looked up a headline recently. Since she has decided to run, her campaign has raised close to $500 million. $500 million. $500 million. Why does a campaign cost that much? And how much could that money be used for something else? And what is accepting that money forcing Kamala Harris to do? So in this next section, we're going to have a very special guest, someone that I've gotten to know a little bit more since I've been on Cornbread Tube, as they let me know, Lucretia McEvil. And I won't give too much context to this, but Lucretia and I have talked on and off about this kind of theory or approach to looking at state violence that I think is really useful for a lot of different kinds of people. So I'll let them jump in and give a lot of their thoughts, and please go like, comment, and subscribe on their channel because they do amazing anarchist, queer, sex positive sort of analyses and perspectives on history and what's happening now in the world. So check out their channel. And there is a video on their channel between me and Lucretia and my other co-host of the Dugout podcast. So check that out too.
I've been saying that we're in a abusive relationship with the American government for quite some time, but I'm excited to be able to talk to you about what I really mean in this specific context. I have been radicalized for quite some time in my life. As an older millennial, I remember the same hope feeling that Obama gave Black folks and marginalized groups in general, because there was a marginalized person in power. And back then, I mean, I graduated in 2009. 2008 was about hope and excitedness. I saw my mom cry, being so excited that Obama got elected. I saw my grandmother, whose parents were sharecroppers, get the vote for Obama. So I understand why people are excited, but I know better. So I'll explain what I mean by that, because for most people, they assume that we on the left are just a bunch of Debbie Downers wanting to cause havoc and take away everybody's joy and fun. But it's because we recognize the inconsistency, the manipulation, and the betrayal of trust that manifests from politicians, whether they're Democratic or otherwise. So the reason why myself, Prince, and other radicals, anarchists, Marxists, believe that political actors are similar to an abuser, abusive husband or partner, is because of those. They flip-flop their stance on things like genocide, climate change, fracking, and Medicare for all, because they know what will win us over, right? They know what will get us excited. Just like my abuser knew what I needed to forgive him. He would say and do whatever was necessary to get me where he wanted me to be. And then when he got me where he wanted me to be, none of that shit mattered anymore. He got what he wanted, essentially. The toxic cycle of abuse typically includes phases like tension building, incident, reconciliation, and calm. In the tension building phase, in a domestic abuse situation, the abuser becomes increasingly irritable, manipulative, or distant. The victim may feel confused, anxious, and constantly on edge, trying to appease the abuser or to prevent a blow up. They know something's happening. They know when the shoe's about to drop. Not exactly when, but they can feel it subconsciously. We also can feel it when candidates like Kamala show early signs of inconsistency or hesitation in their stances. It causes anxiety amongst supporters and communities affected by genocide. Before Joe Biden actually stepped down, Kamala was going around saying that she was unequivocally supporting a ceasefire. And she knew that would get people excited about voting for her, because that is the reason why so many of us on the left refuse to vote for Joe Biden. But now that she has the candidacy secured, there's less than 60 days left until the election. She went mask off a few days ago and saying that she unequivocally supports Israel and she will not change her stance on that ever. Where maybe a month ago, people were yelling at me and other activists and anarchists on social media saying that we were being misogynistic or anti-black misogynist or perpetuating misogynoir because we didn't want to support Kamala. But it's because we had the foresight to know that she was full of shit. It doesn't matter if she's a black woman, she's still full of shit. She's selling bullshit, just like Obama did before him. So there's a sense of distrust building between those on the left, Muslim Americans, Palestinian Americans, and anyone who is against genocide. The candidate is sending mixed signals on purpose and is avoiding taking a clear position on purpose. And it's so funny hearing liberals talk shit about Donald Trump doing that, when Kamala does the same exact thing. They'll make excuses for her, but when it comes to Donald Trump, they don't like the inconsistency. So I say to that, make up your fucking minds. The next similarity or parallel we can draw is the incident phase. So when an abuser actually does inflict physical, emotional, or verbal harm against someone. So the incident occurs and then the abuser may lash out, gaslight, or demean the victim. This phase is characterized by overt harm and betrayal specifically. With Kamala and the Democratic Party in general, but her public flip-flops, such as shifting from condemning genocide to downplaying it or failing to take action when in a position of power. Currently, she keeps talking about what she will do when she's president, but she's vice president now. When she openly does things not letting the uncommitted voters speak at the DNC, when they openly allow cops to speak at the DNC, when they openly do not acknowledge the genocide. This is a moment of clear betrayal and harm to the trust of those who relied on that. After the incident in a domestic violence situation, the reconciliation phase happens next. The abuser will apologize, make excuses, or promise change. So that's when gifts come, affection comes, and manipulative assurances are given to make people stay and create false hope. The false hope is them mentioning fracking, banning fracking every 4 years. The false hope is them mentioning Medicare for all. The false hope is them saying they'll codify Roe when they had 40 years to codify Roe. That's the false hope. They need something to dangle over your head in order for you to keep participating. If they gave you just what you wanted, there would be no reason to control us. Same thing with an abuser. If an abuser wants you to behave a certain way, they're not going to allow you to make choices that prevent you from behaving a certain way. It's fixed. In this context, when it comes to politicians and Kamala, she backtracks and is attempting damage control. And that's currently what the phase we're in now, especially since 2 or 3 days ago, she said that she supports Israel unequivocally. It's so weird how Democrats will kill the momentum that they've built. But when you have to play the game, you'll go as far to the right as possible to show them that you're down. It's black cop syndrome, which is why Also, it's dangerous that she will be in office. We don't need KRS-One, black cops, and the fucking presidency. In what context do you find out what you buy after you spend money? It doesn't happen anywhere. So after reconciliation, there's the calm phase. In a period of apparent peace, after a domestic abuse flare up or situation where the abuser is now on their best behavior and the victim believes that things have changed. Okay, they bought me flowers. It's been a month. He hasn't raised his voice at me. He hasn't yelled at me. But the underlying issues still remain unaddressed. And especially at this point, for abusers, they expect you to forgive and forget anything that they have done, especially if they've been on their best behavior. So, in the context of Kamala, the Democratic Party, and the Biden administration, they temporarily aligned with our expectations. Ooh, ceasefire this, ceasefire that. But I just watched something recently of Hassan Minhaj, and he asked Bernie Sanders, what's your definition of ceasefire? Because apparently it means different things to different people. And it's true. They were calling it a humanitarian pause fucking 6 months ago. They said temporary ceasefire. Like I said, the polls will come back and people will be pissed. So she will temporarily align with us, giving speeches, talking about a ceasefire, all the things that are exciting all the liberals about her right now, the things that she's doing right now, where it's just lip service, no action. And the cycle of betrayal is primed to repeat as soon as political pressures change. And they will. Like I said, September, October, she's going to be nice to us. But October to November, they will no longer be nice to us because things are at stake. And you'll see it. I mean, it already started. That's why I deleted my TikTok when she announced her candidacy. Because I was getting so much misogynoir, anti-black sexism, and hatred just because I said I want her to earn my vote. Isn't that what she's supposed to do? And the reason why people are clinging on to her is because we're desperate. Don't you understand that you would drink toilet water if you were in the desert? Don't y'all understand that? And that's where we are right now with our electoral politics. And in the context of the election, it's difficult, right? Because people go crazy over elections. You're supposed to vote, especially if you're black. Your ancestors died for your right to vote. And I would like to reframe that. I think my ancestors died for my choice. They died and suffered so I can have a choice. They knew that this place was not built for them, which is why they had to suffer through it. So I think it's not only disrespectful, but cheap to bring up the ancestral line of black people when you want them to do whatever you want. It's very, yeah, there's a lot I could dive into it, but basically the advice I would give to us to stop being abused by these candidates is to stop engaging with them. Everyone keeps saying, oh, third party votes will split the candidacy and give the votes to Donald Trump. Not if we have a lot of third party votes. We all just have to drop out. Stop picking the two people that are hurting you. You have to just take your ball and go home. That's how you stop abuse from happening. By removing yourself from the situation. Because if it's up to the abuser, they'll do it until you die. I saw a tweet the other day, and I'll end on this. I'm afraid us telling the Democratic Party that we'll vote for the lesser of two evils gave them carte blanche to think that there's something more evil than genocide.
Why does defining the state as fascist matter? And why does being anti-fascist matter? And what I'm kind of returning to again and again and again is that when we experience the violence of the state, the anti-Black violence, the xenophobic violence, the colonial violence, the imperialistic violence, all of the forms of violence that the state resorts to, and it's seen as legitimate, what happens in the aftermath is we blame ourselves. We blame each other. And this isn't to say that people can't reinforce the logic, violence, and processes of the state in terms of denigrating other people or destroying them. But I think it's a deeper question of, are we fighting each other or are we fighting a system? And if it's each other, I think a part of colonialism, imperialism, fascism is telling us how we're separate, sowing that dissent, sowing that division, not allowing us to even imagine a world outside of the horrors of the system that we live under. I mean, even earlier, I went on X, the formerly Twitter, and you can see bodies of people destroyed, families torn apart, literal graphic images that are reminders of the violence that our state corroborates, our state funds. And anti-fascism to me is a serious question of, what kind of future do I demand? What kind of future do I demand in terms of whether or not I speak up about how my state funds genocide, whether or not I want a fair economy or a quality way of life for myself or my mother. I think about the fact that my family came to this country for the American dream, and look at what the American dream produces. Look at what it produces here and around the world. All of the people wrapped up in incarceration for simply resisting. And when I think about it that way, I think of what a horrible trick this system, this government, this two-party system is trying to spin. Look at who is running for office and whether or not they can speak out directly about a genocide. And if they can't do that, if that can't even include an arms embargo or demanding a removal of the settlements, demanding that Palestine be seen as autonomous and sovereign in its own right, what are they really, what is our government really offering other than aiding in this terror, both abroad and here? And when I think of the question of liberation and survival in terms of violence, especially political violence, state sanctioned political violence, I think there is a lot against us, but also Black history teaches me that we don't fight just because we're going to win. We don't resist just because we're going to win. We resist because it's the right thing to do. It is what will bring us closer to our humanity. It's how we show other people that another world is possible. So to me, anti-fascism it's a reclamation of ourselves in a world that tells us to ignore our own humanity and to ignore the humanity of others and to ignore the fact that our government funds degradation of other human beings and other nations by the billions of dollars every year. Billions, probably trillions. I wish things were better. I wish we had a government that didn't lie to us. I wish we didn't have a government that lies to us while it brutalizes us and other people. And it scares me that while we're all living and working through our traumas, we have governments, institutions, the state literally also exists to traumatize us or to corroborate a reality of suffering. And that makes me angry because I think we all deserve so much more. So much more. What a week! What a week! Is a white capitalist man who is a sexual assaulter, who is racist, who has had a history of documented racism, whether it be socially or through his business practices. He has evaded taxes. When you think about what a greedy and evil white politician is, Trump is one of the archetypes.
Every woman lied when they came forward to hurt my campaign.
And so for this white man who has pushed his way into the political world, who wants to constantly paint himself as a victim and an underdog, despite being of the exact demographic category that Americanism and Manifest Destiny has curated most of social life to succeed, Donald Trump wants to paint himself as an underdog.
Communication and awareness of your environment. Oftentimes, people look at the president and they have blinders on. They don't even realize that their own action and what they're doing around the president. Here we see a young woman who starts hugging the president and doesn't let go.
For a white man of that nature to be in his presidential campaign, raising millions of dollars. I'm editing this video right now. I can't fucking believe this. There's a headline. Elon Musk has said he is committing around $45 million a month to a new pro-Trump super PAC. $45 million a month. $45 million a month? Because of Pennsylvania? $45 million a month? An assassination attempt on his life legitimizes this underdog narrative. It legitimizes this notion that Trump tries to paint, that he is a victim. And what I think is sick about Trump's position in all of this is that despite being rich and an elite his whole life and having no class consciousness, all of the bigotry and xenophobia and fear-mongering that he's spewing to radicalize and garner his base. I think Trump employs a lot of strawman arguments that radicalizes a lot of poor people that want someone charismatic in office, and they don't care who needs to be beneath them in that process. This attempt on Trump fits into this underdog narrative perfectly. How was a 20-year-old with a weapon able to get even close enough to do this? Secret Service typically goes into a space, an area where an event is going to be, especially with a former president. After you're president, they have Secret Service follow you for years. You're not allowed to drive yourself.
We start looking at long-range issues that I need to address. I need aerial surveillance. I need the ability to understand what that airspace looks like above me. I need to understand if I'm near a terrain feature such as water, how do I mitigate the vulnerability that's coming from that waterway? So do I need police boats out there? That starts to become that outer ring. So protective methodology in these concentric rings, you want to address those types of threats as far out as possible. That's really the tradecraft, and it comes down to experience. It comes down to constant training and communication and awareness of your environment.
How? Why would it not be staged? And does it not make total political sense for someone in Trump's team to pay someone or to orchestrate a situation where mere days before the Republican National Convention, mere months before the presidential election, on a fascist president's life to legitimize his political platform, instead of the fact that this is a white man who has made enemies? Why does whiteness get to politicize violence for its own gain while everyone else, people of color, indigenous people, undocumented people, LGBTQIA people, and beyond, the violence that they experience or is enacted against them is either criminalized or invisibilized? Trump is a racist capitalist with countless enemies, with so many things that he's done wrong, and is a legitimate threat to political autonomy and democracy. Whether or not Americanism, as it stands within the two-party system and the oligarchy that it is the solution to Trump, I don't fucking agree with that. Think about the fact that when Trump lost the election 4 years ago, he spread so much disinformation and lies that he radicalized and stoked the political anger of thousands of people in Washington, D.C., to the point that these people stormed A federal building scaled walls, scaled gates, went in, broke windows, live streamed, took photos, threatened politicians, threatened people. And this was all because of Trump's disinformation and his team's disinformation. This can just be a part of Americanism, just like a sport team wins and white people go into the city and they turn over cars and they burn shit. That's not a riot. But black people opposing police brutality and burning some shit in their neighborhoods, that's riot, that's violent. Now we can also look at what's currently happening with the ongoing genocide against Palestinians, and Netanyahu continues to call Palestinians children of darkness. He continues to conflate all Palestinians essentially with Hamas. We can see once again how the political elite can use a particular act of violence to legitimize a unbelievable campaign of destruction in response for the cause of colonial violence and displacement that numerous war profiting companies that have started in the US have speed delivered thousands and thousands of bombs, like Boeing Company. And somehow certain forms of political violence, when they serve the oligarchy, when they serve the elite, or they serve profit, somehow that is just like totally acceptable. Or if it serves fascism. We can look at 9/11. A terrorist attack happens on US soil, and for the next decade, the US can go into other regions of the world, bomb it, drone it, kill countless civilians, create entire carceral structures of torture like Guantanamo Bay, and legitimize it. Over a decade. When I name all these different forms of political violence, I think what it comes back to again is that when elitism is under attack, whiteness and elitism gets to respond however it wants. It gets to over-police, it gets to resort to militarism, it gets to pass laws that restrict freedom of speech or human rights. I mean, look at 2020. Yet another black person was brutally killed by police. And around the country, around the world, people responded by the millions, if not billions. And what did the US government do? Instead of listening to legitimate claims to either reform policing or to abolish it altogether, instead of responding to countless demands across different cities in the US, different city councils, politicians, they had a chance to respond to countless demands that provided structures and processes and frameworks on how to move towards abolition. Yet, for weeks on end, what did our government do? Whether federal or state, they parroted certain claims about police reform or abolition, funneled National Guard, the military into countless cities across the country to brutalize people, white vans going into cities and snatching people up, cities passing laws that essentially make protesting illegal if you have over a handful of people gathering, door knocks from FBI agents in numerous cities. Once again, we can see that any sort of unrest or political violence enacted by the marginalized will always be considered a threat to Americanism and democracy as we know it. Yet political violence staged or enacted or radicalized by the elite is seen as totally legitimate and something that the masses, that people like me, a queer black person, just have to deal with. When people that look like me get killed on screen and it gets spread around and people are actually angry, they'll just send in the military to fuck you up. To have a nation built upon the genocide of indigenous people to be bought and built with the labor of slaves. All of these things are a foundational part of Americanism, and they're literally taught in our history books. They're taught to children. This propaganda and disinformation is spread through the news. And that leads to one of the big first news events that I remember understanding the savagery of how elitism and whiteness treats blackness is Hurricane Katrina. These images are where my realization started that our suffering is fuel. And for this world to change, we have to redefine what our suffering means for ourselves and for everyone else. The violence enacted against us is profit.
We are black people and we shouldn't have to feel like this. We shouldn't have to protest because y'all are treating us wrong. We do this because we need to and have rights. Our fathers and mothers are killed, and we can't even see them anymore. It's a shame that we have to go to that graveyard and bury them. And we have tears, and we shouldn't have tears. We need our fathers and mothers to be by our side.
15 years old. He had to watch this as this was put all over the outlets and everything that was possible to be shown.
I believe that we live in a political system that literally uses violence to control people, to propagandize people. It uses our carceral system to criminalize modes of behavior that are a byproduct of capitalism and how it drains resources, how it creates hierarchy, how it puts people at the bottom, how it exploits certain class positions. And then it criminalizes that through force, through carceral violence, through so many things. Almost every form of violence that the state can enact is considered legitimate on some level, but the violence that regular people enact in their lives is so deeply criminalized, yet that criminalization also works towards profit, the prison industrial complex. This is a time to oppose fascism. This is a time to name fascism, to name the different components of it, to name the ways that fascism uses spectacles of violence, the way fascism stages certain events. It's a time to call out the theatricalness of US and American politics. I mean, January 6th, does anyone remember the Onion lady? The lady that claimed she stormed into the Capitol, and you can see the live stream, and she's like, they maced me, There's an onion in her rag.
What's your name? Where are you from?
Elizabeth, I'm from Knoxville, Tennessee.
And why did you want to go in?
We're storming the Capitol. It's a revolution.
Thank you.
It's all political theater, but it's political theater to serve whiteness and to serve fascism. Opposing fascism necessitates that regular people like you and me, that on an individual and collective level, we understand the many different points of intervention. And I think this right now is another major opportunity to exercise a point of intervention. How are we talking about political violence? How are we talking about political violence enacted by different kinds of bodies on this land and in this country? How are we talking about how the mainstream news navigates fascism, how it doesn't take fascism seriously as a threat, how legitimizing the two-party system is another form of upholding a certain kind of fascism, a certain kind of oligarchy, a certain kind of lie about what democracy actually is. And that can also include hiring someone to make a fake attempt on your life days before the Republican National Convention, while you're a white man painting yourself as an underdog. Opposing fascism means that we must be skeptical of how political violence against the elite legitimizes mainstream politics, legitimizes campaigns of genocide, political conquest, and taking away of human rights, taking away of the right to protest, taking away of the right to freedom of speech, saying that anyone that disagrees with Trump or his team is against democracy or Americanism. Instead, we have to concentrate on empowering the masses to liberate ourselves. And so this brings the question of, if this assassination attempt will lead to Trump being able to raise millions of more dollars, being able to further radicalize his base and legitimize his identity, a strong leader, as someone who can survive being economically targeted, legally targeted, socially targeted, and now physically targeted. If he can paint himself as a hero, as someone worth becoming like, and Trump wins, what are people ready to do in order to oppose fascism and authoritarianism? The two-party system, whether it's a liberal or a conservative or someone in between, it still all legitimizes holding up a false democracy, and a democracy based in this long historical genocidal reality of violence, where some people deserve to die and some people deserve to live. But I think we all have to be prepared to really analyze and understand what mainstream media is here for. It's here to tell stories that get views and feed advertising dollars and feed a business model. I think we should be very aware of how politicians use decorum or respectability to bow down to fascism. And I think we should take very seriously what we're going to do to protect ourselves and our communities if there is another Trump presidency or if there's another Biden presidency. I think regardless, we can look at the protests supporting Palestine on different US campuses, how much brutality occurred, how much state violence occurred, that no matter if it's a Democrat or Republican in office, we should still be worried. I just had a conversation with my friend today who is also a comrade, and we talked about Product 2025, Chapel Roan, sociopolitical media literacy, and the ongoing threat of imperialistic violence enacted by the US and how it is so important to articulate the specifics of these things. Hopefully this is legible for people because I'm really feeling a lot. And a lot of it is still tied to Springfield, Ohio. It's still tied to how the fears around Project 2025 is causing so many people to fearmonger and then push people towards Kamala Harris. We live in this socio-political environment where people still believe that politicians are actually here to help us. Politicians are actually here to help us. It's a fucking lie. I will say it again. Politicians operate just like police officers. They will lie to you to get what they want in terms of the state's values. The problem isn't Product 2025. It's our lack of capacity to resist, because that's really what so many things come down to for me. I understand the existential threat of Product 2025 as people state it, but I also don't understand how people can name that as an existential threat, but not name all of the other forms of state violence as an existential threat just as clearly, because it doesn't as materially affect them because they don't see it as a danger. It hasn't been articulated to them as a danger. So let's dive into it. I watched the political event that Oprah Winfrey hosted in favor of Kamala Harris, where like Harris showed up and they had all these different people talk, and it was very emotional, and they had a child survivor of one of these school pew pew events, and I honestly found myself sitting down through that and being like, wow, this is really emotional, and I'm glad so many things are being acknowledged. And then I just was like, wait, Kamala Harris is literally a part of a government that funds war and genocide and is standing by Israel's right to defend itself and to SA people and to literally like destroy entire generations of families, to displace entire generations of people. So why is Oprah what? And then I kind of came back to reality. It wasn't like I was really swayed, but I came back to reality and I was like, oh yeah, Oprah is a part of the billionaire elite, and so is Kamala Harris. And the Black elite have to corroborate each other's narratives around change. The whole notion that Kamala Harris is building this campaign where we're not going back, we're not going back, we're not going back, like we need to have our voting rights, we're not going back. I wonder if for some Black people like the elite, does not going back just mean that we become a part of white supremacy? Does it mean that we become a tool of capitalism, that we become a tool of the empire, that we stand by as billions of dollars is being funneled into wars and the torture and genocide of people in other nations? If that is our definition of not going back, what is going forward? What is going forward as people that are willing to assimilate into the Black elite and the way that they corroborate white supremacy, imperialism, hegemony, etc.?
So answer, tell me, yes. Because I want to make sure I clarify before I respond to it, is that because Kamala is a Black woman and she's running as a Black woman and she's not speaking out against things that you want her to, she's using her Black womanhood to
power and Black excellence, and it was weaponized in the Obama presidency. But so let me.
Could it be something else?
Please
could it
educate me.
Could it be? I know her.
Yes.
Could it be that she is someone who listens to voices on all sides? Could it be that when the opportunity, you can turn your head, but I've been in the room.
The reason that this needs to be brought up is that when I see so much of what the Republicans are saying versus the Democrats are saying, I've said this a lot of times online. You either have the overt fascism of the right and the right wing and the Republican Party, or you have these smoke screens of progress that are actually leading towards the fascistic tendencies of the right. What does it mean that the news is constantly saying, oh, we have the lowest number of migrant crossings in a number of years? It's because there are more punitive measures that make it more difficult for people to find refugee status. 20,000 Haitian immigrants were put in Springfield, Ohio, and then given next to no resources in a community where the economy was already kind of destabilized and people are looking for jobs. It's difficult for people to buy homes. When the state does not step in, division can be sown, disinformation can occur, And people that are literally just there to work, to assimilate, to find their version of the American dream, become the scapegoats and the recipient of extrajudicial and state violence. Why has it taken until now for the Springfield government to acknowledge on a larger level the lack of resources that has been offered to Haitian immigrants there? And why have Black people in Springfield, Ohio, gone to city councils and spewed xenophobic and fear-mongering, and then later on will apologize? What information are we intaking? What is our understanding of the exact political context that this information is coming from? Who is becoming the scapegoats of particular kinds of violence? And who is willing to step in these particular kinds of violence, whether it be fascistic violence, state violence, police violence, any form of violence derived from the state, because the state will view its own violence as legitimate and then will view any violence in resistance to it as criminal, illegal, unpatriotic, whatever, instead of it being people resisting a system that is literally built on war and genocide.
Good morning, APAC. Good morning. What an honor. And I'm proud to say and be that among the many voices represented here, the California delegation is the largest and hopefully the loudest. There you go. I did what I often do when visiting a new country. I visited the highest court in the land. And as I toured Israel's Supreme Court, I was struck by the iconic architecture, which embodies Israel's founding principles of democracy and rule of law. It's why I became a prosecutor and personally prosecuted everything from low-level offenses to homicides. It's why I became San Francisco District Attorney and was later elected Attorney General of California, where I took on, where I took on transnational gangs, cyber criminals, and mortgage fraud. And that commitment to justice is why I ran to become a United States Senator from the great state of California. The point being to continue that fight. And a critical piece of my agenda is the fight to defend and strengthen our national security. As a member of both the Senate Intelligence Committee and Homeland Security Committee, I have a front row seat to these issues. And I am proud to stand strongly with America's allies, including Israel. Israel and the Jewish community will always be a priority for me.
I haven't really gone into detail about Project 2025 or explored it very much on this channel. Honestly, it's mainly because I've been annoyed around the fear-mongering around it. I understand that it's scary. I understand that the wish list is fucking horrible and disgusting. But I also understand that Democrats will sell out movements and throw people into prison. And people like Kamala Harris have been a part of corroborating a carceral system, even if they can pass certain measures that reduce recidivism. If you work for the state and you work for carcerality and you built a career out of that, you probably locked people up unjustly, and you've probably corroborated a logic that says that that is okay. Black people, as people that are products of immigration, as people that understand the very real racialized violence that the carceral system puts us through, to then go into that system and to help it by any means, to me, is a sign of evil and political compromise. And that is where I stand on at least Harris. Fear of Project 2025 isn't enough for me to run towards a candidate like Kamala Harris, which is what's interesting about like seeing the news and what everything one is talking about online. If chaperone won't endorse a candidate, like that means that they're a Republican, like a queer person from the Midwest who didn't want to perform at the White House and actually wanted to perform Palestinian like poems is a Republican. Political engagement online is partially and largely turning into just another entertainment system. And when people in my last video, as I said, joke about memes and dance to xenophobic logic and make light of it, you're turning it into entertainment when it's actually becoming increasingly our political reality, which is why I want to spend a little bit of time in this video talking about Project 2025 and a bit of what it entails, because I think we do need to be specific about the violence and the wish list that it can produce, because this is a production of the right wing, and the right wing do have a stranglehold on a lot of things politically and media wise and socially in this country. So let's dig into it. So there is an article from the BBC titled Product 2025, the right wing wish list for another Trump presidency. Read a few sections of it to give you an idea if folks out there aren't already aware of what Product 2025 entails so far. So the article reads, it's a 900-page policy wish list for the next Republican president, a proposal that would expand the presidential power and impose an ultra-conservative social vision. What you're going to hear tonight is a detailed and dangerous plan called Product 2025 the former president intends on implementing if he were elected again, Vice President Kamala Harris said early in the ABC News presidential debate. Donald Trump, who had recently disavowed the document, responded, I have nothing to do with Project 2025. Dozens of former Trump administration officials have, however, contributed to the think tank's proposals, providing Democrats with an attack line against the former president. The backlash against some of the more radical proposals in Project 2025, conceived by the Conservative Heritage Foundation think tank, has been intense. And then going on, it talks about the governmental changes that Project 2025 proposes. Project 2025 proposes that the entire federal bureaucracy, including independent agencies such as the Department of Justice, be placed under direct presidential control, a controversial idea known as unitary executive theory. In practice, that would streamline decision-making, allowing the president to directly implement policies in a number of areas. The proposals also call for eliminating job protections for thousands of government employees who could then be replaced by political appointees. The document labels the FBI a bloated, arrogant, increasingly lawless organization. It calls for drastic overhauls of this and several other federal agencies, as well as the complete elimination of the Department of Justice. I don't fuck with the government or the state as it stands, but to remove these departments that are there to perform checks and balances just shows you how fascistic the people surrounding Trump wish to be. And to call the FBI bloated, arrogant, increasingly lawless organization, that's because the FBI has been targeting people within Trump's administration, holding them to task alongside the Department of Justice. But the FBI has also historically aided and abetted dismantling movements, targeting movements, performing all sorts of counterinsurgency, and even killing people.
This is 2337 West Monroe, described by police as a depot for Black Panther Party arms and ammunition. 14 state's attorney's policemen, led by Sergeant Daniel Grove, found out indeed it was a depot for weapons. After a 15-minute gun battle that cost Illinois Black Panther Party Chairman Fred Hampton his life.
On the morning of December 4th, you're going to decide whether or not Fred Hampton and Mark Clark were the victims of premeditated murder.
They came with a murder on their mind, you see. Even if they wanted to take somebody to jail, it would be a simple matter of just shooting some tear gas in here to draw everybody out, right on.
Killing people that are considered unpatriotic or against whatever goal of the U.S. imperialism is. So it's just interesting that, like, when I hear the term unitary executive theory, like, I just got to bring this book back. I literally have to bring this book back. This fucking book. Read this fucking book. The way this book is breaking down so many of the things that I see in Project 2025 is beautiful, nuts, scary, also like deeply helpful for me in engaging in these conversations. And one thing that this book really delves into is how fascism necessitates that there be a leader who is considered almost godlike, considered mythic in their capacity to imbue a political truth that is beyond science or quantitative logic or even thinking. It's about emotion, it's about force, it's about violence. And think of what a Trump government would do if getting into office. But also think about what a Harris administration would do in terms of building cop cities, in terms of building a stronger border, and in terms of literally throwing movements under the bus. I think they're two sides of the same coin. Dimensions of abortion in Project 2025, there are about 200 of them, have sparked some of the most contentious debates. The document does not call for an outright nationwide abortion ban, and Trump says he would not sign such a law. We don't fucking trust him. However, it proposes withdrawing the abortion pill, the abortion pill mifepristone from the market and use existing but little enforced laws to stop the drug being sent through the post. And it goes on to say, more generally, the document suggests that the Department of Health and Human Services should maintain a biblically based social science reinforced definition of marriage and family. Does that mean I can't get it means I can't get gay married. It means I can't get gay married. It means I probably can't get gay married. This to me is just embarrassing because it means that people haven't resisted enough to the point that this wouldn't even be fucking possible. And I think that is what is also scary to me. And that's what I want to talk about in a later section of this video when I talk about like the internet and the pacification of memifying online and the glorification of politicians. It's wild. It's wild. Increased funding for a wall on the US-Mexican border, one of Trump's signature proposals in 2016, is proposed in the document. Project 2025 also proposes the dismantling of the Department of Homeland Security and combining it with other immigration enforcement units and other agencies, creating a much larger and more powerful border policing operation. Other proposals include eliminating visa categories for crime and human trafficking victims, eliminating and increasing fees on immigrants, and allowing fast-tracked applications for migrants who pay a premium. Not all of these details are repeated in the Republican Party platform, but the overall headlines are similar. The party is promising to implement the largest deportation program in American history. And what is very telling here is that even if Trump says that he doesn't endorse Project 2025, even if he wasn't a part of it, what has happened since he's talked all his crap about Springfield, Ohio? He's since said that he is willing to deport Haitians from that community. J.D. Vance has doubled down on his extremely violent, vulgar, xenophobic myths about Haitian immigrants, including saying that they've increased the number of HIV and AIDS in Springfield, Ohio. And if you read into the local news in Springfield, Ohio, you see the kind of kettle bomb of the fact that immigrants were brought there, weren't offered resources, that sort of destabilizes the already like fragile nature of the way that people in the US view immigrants, relate to xenophobia, and it activated a lot of fuckery, a lot of disinformation, and it led to someone in that community writing a post that they ended up apologizing about. The part of Project 2025 that is really, really scary to me as a child of immigrants is that it talks about denaturalization, which is essentially denaturalizing people that have come here and have found visas or green cards or citizenship. And I can only imagine what that would mean. For me, that would mean most people in my family would probably be up for denaturalization. And I don't even think it would stop there. I mean, there's also things in Project 2025 that talks about expanding ICE's capacity to go into people's homes, to reduce the number of reasons and regulations as to why they would be able to go into people's homes. And I think so much about how Israel and the Zionist state operates in terms of how it treats Palestinians, locking up thousands and thousands of children over the years, displacing people from their homes, inviting settlers in, inviting all kinds of state and extrajudicial violence onto Palestinians, and how this is just accepted because these people are considered less than human beings, if not citizens, people capable of having rights. And I do not put it past any of these policies or a Trump administration to say, like, you're a child of immigrants and you don't agree with the way our government operates, you're going back to the island. You're going back to here. You're going back to here. And the reason that this particularly pisses me off, and it makes me think about how disgusting it is that people are laughing to the Springfield, Ohio jokes online, is that when Trump won in 2016, my mother called me and said, why did I become a citizen for this? I immediately started going online. I was looking up how to become a Border Patrol agent. Granted, I did research it a lot, and then I realized that you, at some point, theoretically have to take a polygraph test. And I was like, depending on the questions they ask me, I'm not gonna pass. I disrupted a Bill Clinton speech in 2016. They're not gonna let me in. And it became that real for me because I thought if the state is going to target my family or other people's families like mine, I want to be aware and I want to have the capacity to do something to resist unjust policies. And when people laugh online, when people make jokes about it, when people pacify it, it's just to me the same kind of people that will sit there when someone says some horrible stuff to an immigrant in public or talks down on someone's ability to speak English. Like, if you can find humor in xenophobia, I wonder what you will sit by and let happen. I wonder if you will actually stick up for Palestinians or people in Congo or people experiencing the ravages of US colonialism and imperialism in other parts of the world. Or will you just go online and joke about it because it's funny to you? The denaturalization thing, I think, is just it is an expression of a very ongoing sentiment that has existed in the US forever and ever and ever. Some kind of immigrants are fine and some kind of immigrants are not. It's the immigrants that will assimilate and can speak perfect English and can contribute economically. That is the value that our country is saying that immigrants bring. It's not that they're human beings deserving of respect and autonomy and resources and dignity. It's saying you need to come here and contribute something by our standards, or else we're gonna kick you out, or we're gonna find it humorous enough when people talk shit on you to dance about it online. And that to me is just it's deplorable. And it reduces my faith in most people's capacity that are dancing online to actually show up and resist and to do something. Or maybe they'll show up at the last minute when they realize how fucking serious things are. And honestly, if I'm at a protest and I see someone personally who's dancing online, they're gonna have problems with me. Should people be afraid of Project 2025, or should people be afraid that we exist in a political apparatus that makes Project 2025 even possible? That it makes it possible for the Democratic Party to parrot and puppet the language of the right in order to bring people from the center more to the left, while funding genocide and war. Project 2025 builds on the US's long history of state violence, particularly against marginalized communities, immigrant communities, Black, brown, poor, indigenous communities. And from a Black liberation perspective, this is not a new existential threat. It's a more explicit version of the oppression that has already been embedded in the US political system. What was COINTELPRO? What were the MOVE bombings? What happened in Flint, Michigan with water? What happened in Standing Rock? What is happening in communities all around the US where students are rising up and protesting a genocide and being kicked out of their housing, losing their student funding, losing their jobs, potentially being at risk to losing their degrees and their chance at a future through higher education? And I have to ask, is the US moving towards fascism, or are we simply witnessing an escalation of the long-standing imperialist tendencies that the US resorts to? And these policies fit into a broader framework, as I've mentioned in How the US is Fascist video. If you haven't seen it, you should watch it. It's a banger. I love it. I'm honestly so proud of that video. This framework builds into a larger process of global anti-Blackness, anti-xenophobia sentiments, white hegemony and white supremacy, capitalism and colonization. The internet and social media literacy, or lack thereof, fits into this. If people can go online and for weeks on end laugh about the Springfield, Ohio situation while not reading articles or educating themselves on the specific context of what's happening there in their own communities, it means they can laugh at the next horrific xenophobic comment that is made, or they can laugh at the next number of rights that are taken away, or they can make light of the fact that Trump might win again, or Kamala's going to win, and cop cities are going to be built. If we can laugh as we descend into the slippery slope of fascism, how do we expect to save ourselves? And how do people that are laughing as this happen expect other people to have respect for them or want to save them? And this isn't to say that I think people are unforgivable or the jokes online are just all totally in bad faith, but I have a really, really real kind of demand. What is our boundary in line for laughing at, making light of, and finding lightness in state violence, xenophobic violence? What is the line? Is the line when Project 2025 is officially launched and the government's going to put out a news broadcast and say it's happening, and people are actually going to go out into the streets and join organizations and resist? No, those same people laughing online are just going to be online, talking to their screen, making jokes about it, and probably hiding in their houses while the ICE is going in and going into people's houses and ripping people out and putting them on buses and shipping them out, or worse. What is the line? What is the line? How does the way that we consume media, particularly through memes and political satellite culture, prevent us from fully understanding the stakes of this current political moment? Social media as a tool for the political elite to engage with us, it's blurring the lines. It's the reason that there's been so much talk about the fact that at this most recent DNC, there were a lot more influencers and live streamers and internet people than there were mainstream journalists. And it's a complicated conversation to talk about, but I think essentially what a lot of it distills down to is that with the more that we engage in the internet and social media, the more people gain a distrust of mainstream media, the more people rely on content and the addictiveness of it to help us work through the socio-political reality that we're existing in. And the fact that politicians can participate in this online rat race and have likes and follows and people that are younger than them, like leading their social media campaigns and helping them do dances and helping them do live streams and podcasts and becoming political pundits, it becomes this very weird space where I question, are we engaging in political activity? Are we engaging in organizing and mass mobilization? Are we engaging in social media platforms to prop up the elite and help them attain their platforms and help them attain power? When essentially, when we engage online, we have next to no power in terms of these social media corporations. We can't really hold them accountable for the disinformation that they benefit from in terms of the algorithm and advertising and profiting and rage farming. And when politicians begin to engage in this, it becomes this very, very dangerous game where we reduce politics to the spectacle of personality, where if someone can be charismatic like Trump, they can gain a following. If someone can be endearing and represent what every Black woman or every immigrant wants to be in terms of being a part of the American dream, you support Kamala. But if you really question their policies on immigration, on militarization, on genocide, on war profiting, on their ability to be conscientious objectors to the imperialistic violence that the US deploys, one, it's not really possible because they go into the system to work for it. And two, that would mean that they would lose their funding. How much money did Biden receive from AIPAC that was rolled over to Kamala Harris's campaign? How many AIPAC events has Kamala Harris spoken at? And why would we expect any different from people that are being glorified and told that they are saving us? They are the reason that we're not turning back. Kamala Harris is the reason that Black people aren't going to sit on the back of the bus again. They're just going to be living in cities where cops are even more militarized and can beat you up at a protest. And then you'll probably catch some RICO charges. That's not going back. When we look at the glorifying of politicians and the way that internet culture kind of pacifies us into political complicity, we can dive into how fascism will not always look like the Hollywood villain, but will be incremental, legalized, and normalized through media, especially when both parties use immigrants as scapegoats. Look at what Kamala Harris says about the fact that we need a stronger border. If you're being vague about something, it probably means that you want to reach towards either side of the aisle and you want the capacity to pass things that look more progressive, and you want to be able to pass things that literally demonize immigrants. Even though, Harris, you literally are the product of an immigrant family. It's, to me, it's just like, that's also why I have even less respect for them. I'm like, you're a product of an immigrant family and you get to this position. I wonder what you had to compromise ethically. I wonder. With all of this in mind, with all of the odds stacked against us, with so many things up against us, like, it shouldn't just be Project 2025 is horrible, so vote for Kamala Harris. No, that is not the most logical conclusion I draw here. I encourage other people to draw more complex conclusions, more nuanced conclusions. You can vote third party. You can vote intensely on a local level. You can show up to your city council. You can join organizations that offer mutual aid and protect immigrant communities and offer resources. You can go towards anti-fascist work. You can go towards work that help people that are without housing. You can go towards work that helps protect trans communities, reproductive rights. There are so many different iterations of political mobilization that are possible, but it starts with the question, how do we build the collective belief that resistance is not only possible, but essential in the fight against imperialism and white supremacy? And what does Black resistance to empire look like in a world dominated by global capitalism and militarization? For enslaved Blacks, for enslaved Africans, when they were on those fucking slave fields and they ran into the marshes and they braided their hair to make maps and they found ways of operating within the Underground Railroad and they found ways to hide in the marshes and the woods for weeks on end. When they went towards freedom, it was not with the understanding that it was totally certain that they would get to the north, or that they would achieve autonomy, or that they would get to where they needed to go. It was with the belief that where they were going, the possibility of where they were going was way better than the current reality. And this to me is the core of what I believe and where I come from and what I encourage in most political spaces I'm in. I don't believe that we should resist with the probability that we're going to win, with demanding that we're going to win. Like, this is the strategy that is going to help us win. I don't think there's just one strategy. I don't think there's any one certain outcome in terms of liberation or resistance. I think this country is bought for with blood and genocide and imperialism, and to unravel ourselves from that will look ugly and messy and scary. But the pursuit of a better world, of a better forever, is so much more beautiful than anything that we can imagine right now. The fact that my parents immigrated to this country and built lives for themselves, were able to send me to school, were able to fight to raise me in neighborhoods that were rough, that with all of the problems that my home life and my family life brought, all of the beauty of all of the terror and violence and subjugation that people in my family, especially women, have survived, all of that does not mean that I should fold towards the narrative of political progress that is fed to me by either Trump or Harris or the Democrats or Republicans or people that are scared of state-sanctioned violence. I mean, the Black existence is about surviving state-sanctioned violence. And so to me, to tell people that we need to work towards having a lesser evil, or we need to have a weaker adversary, or Product 2025 is the worst existential threat. The worst existential threat that we can have is that we don't activate our capacity for militant resistance and change, that we allow the state or racists or xenophobes or bigots or people online to determine what we believe is politically possible and viable and necessary in the face of evil and violence and bigotry. And we have a right to resist on a fundamental human level. When we look at how the Vietnamese people resisted the American war, when we look at how Palestinians are resisting the ongoing genocide enacted by Zionism in the state of Israel, we see how important it is to fight regardless of the outcome. Because I do believe that the elite typically dictate history, but even our chance at a future, at survival, at something that is better than this is based on our capacity now to say what we're being offered is not enough. And we need to imagine other ways. We need to have the courage to say that this is not right and something has to change. And that can be a small thing, it can be a big thing, and it can involve so many things. I mean, think about Frantz Fanon, think about Assata Shakur, think of Kwame Ture, how Assata Shakur speaks about in her autobiography that revolution is a science. It's something that should be studied. It's something that has parts, it has processes. And those processes are things that we deserve to dedicate our lives, or at least major portions of our lives, to committing to. And that is not some light thing. It's not something to go online and joke about and ha ha he make fun of xenophobic violence. It's here. It's going to happen. And what are you going to do about it? And I end this video with a series of questions. If we understand that the state thrives on our pacification, what are we willing to sacrifice in order to resist? How do we build a movement that not only fights fascism in the US, but also stands in solidarity with global struggles against imperialism? In a world where both political parties perpetuate violence, state-sanctioned violence, what would a true vision of liberation look like that escapes this constant hamster wheel of running around back and forth, running around back and forth, running around back and forth? What would that look like? I think for me, it would look like maybe, to begin with, free housing, police-free zones. Just saying. And if state violence is normalized, how do we reawaken our belief that we or others do not deserve that violence? How do we resist that violence? Those are questions. Those are questions for you. Those are questions for me too. Thank you for watching another video on my channel. I hope you got something new or developed a new thought from these batch of videos that I've worked really hard on over the last few months. I think election season is wild. I think election years are wild. And I also think it's important to ground ourselves in the core concepts and ideas that drive us to fight for a better world outside of capitalism. So I hope these videos helped you do that, and stay tuned for more.